Good morning, everyone. After figuring out who should be chair, I've been voluntold. I'd like to call this meeting to order. Members of the public are advised that our meetings are webcast live by the City of Hamilton and temporarily archived on the city's website. Other individuals and the media may also be audibly and/or visually recording this meeting. As well, a reminder that all electronic devices are to be switched to non-audible function during committee meetings. Please don't annoy me. Approval of the agenda. Madam Clerk, are there any changes to the agenda?
Through you, Councillor, no, there are none.
Thank you. May I please have a mover and a seconder to approve the agenda as amended? It's an e-vote. Councillor Farr, Councillor Nan, all those in favor? E-vote, please. I think this can be the easiest meeting ever. Declaration of interest. Are there any declarations of interest? I don't see any. So we have a presentation. The 2020 updated tax-supported operating budget outlook and mitigation options citywide. Mr. Segarek will provide the presentation for 6.1. Please pull up a chair, Mr. Segarek. Yeah, did you get new shoes? Oh yeah, Thank you, Stephanie. Good old way to go, Steph. Okay, I'm shutting my mic off, Mr. Segarek. You're on your own.
Through the chair, good morning. This is our second opportunity to be before committee in regards to the 2020 tax-supported operating budget. And the purpose for today is we have some updates for committee with respect to our current position and some areas for discussion as it relates to the approach that staff are taking as it relates to the mitigation measures that were brought before committee back in July and approved by committee in July. And just as a reminder, what was approved by council in July was increases to user fees of approximately 3%, and in cases where either market conditions or for competitive rationale, there is a justification to increase fees at a rate greater than 3% and possibly moving towards full cost recovery. Staff are pursuing those opportunities. With respect to boards and agencies, police, library, conservation authorities, the guideline was 2%. All other boards and agencies, the target, the guideline was 0% for 2020. The tax capital budget was submitted with a total forecast levy impact of 1.3%. The rate budget was submitted with a projected increase of 4.5%. And finally, staff were asked to develop options to reduce the tax impact based on 3 scenarios: a 4.6% residential tax increase, a 3.6% residential tax increase, and a 2.6% residential tax increase. The values aligned with each of those scenarios represents what the levy would have to be reduced by, assuming those residential tax increases. And again, this was information that was presented back in July of this year. So as it relates to objectives today, staff are wanting to provide an update to that previous 6.7% forecast residential tax increase for 2020. We want to provide committee some insight with respect to some challenges, some headwinds we see going into 2021, so beyond 2020, as we continue to evolve our multi-year budget process is to provide committee with some insight beyond the upcoming year, as well as to provide some updated information with respect to the reduction amounts necessary to achieve the 4.6, 3.6, and 2.6% targets. And again, that represents the dollar figures associated with each of those 3 scenarios. Also, we want to describe the approach and some principles that staff are taking as it relates to those three scenarios. And that's principally the takeaway that we're seeking from committee today, is either some confirmation with respect to the principles and approach that staff are taking, or some additional guidance with respect to the approach that staff are taking. Provide some general insight as to the nature of the adjustments that would be required to achieve those reductions, as well as to seek some further direction from committee as relates to the guideline for 2020. So again, what was previously directed was that 2.6% to 4.6% range, and what staff are asking is whether or not committee has a more definitive target going into 2020 beyond that range of 2.6 to 4.6%. This is a graphic that you would have, you may recall from previous presentations. It represents what our residential tax impacts have been over the period 2008 to 2019. And so you can see in general, the average increase over the 12-year period represents about 1.9%. And that's in line with inflation over that period. Inflation over that period was 1.8%, and one of the objectives of previous councils was to try to affect our tax competitiveness in a positive way, given some of our challenges around household income levels. I'll just remind committee that as previously identified, City of Hamilton relative to our comparators, the average household income levels are about 12 to 14% lower than our comparators, and over this period, Council was very mindful of ability to pay and try to achieve some favorable trending as it relates to our tax competitiveness. Also, over the 5-year period, you'll see reference that 5-year average residential, again, these are all residential tax increases, was on average 2.1%. Just want to take a bit of a time just to describe what transpired over some of those years affecting some of those increases. 2008, you'll see, represented a higher level of investment and a higher residential tax increase. In 2008, one of the driving factors to that increase was a $6 million investment in paramedic services, as well as a $4 million investment in boards and agencies, principally police services. So in that particular year, you'll see that those investments represented for the most part, the increase in the residential tax increases. So again, that was $6 million for paramedic services and $4 million boards and agencies, principally Hamilton Police Services. And you'll see again in 2015, one of the higher than average residential tax increase years. Some of the pressures in 2015, again, was paramedic services, as well as our transit affordability program. So just to provide some insight as to some of the pressures in previous years, as well as what we're able to achieve as relates to the residential tax increases. And I want to highlight the point that over this period, this performance shouldn't be interpreted to reflect austerity budgets. Over each one of those years, the City of Hamilton increased service levels or services. And so I don't want to leave committee and the community with an impression that the city has been pursuing austerity budgets in order to positively affect the tax increases, as we have been making some investments in a number of services, paramedics, as well as transit, to name two, over this period. Another factor that would have affected these outcomes is provincial uploading. So for those new councillors, is the previous provincial governments started a 10-year journey with respect to uploading of social services programs. Started back in 2008 with the upload of Ontario Drug Benefit. I believe that was a $10 million upload. So over that period, 2008 to 2017, I think was our last, 2017, 2018 was our last year of upload. The province of Ontario uploaded approximately $95 million in what was previously levy-funded investments. Partially offsetting that $95 million was a clawback of about $50 million in grants associated with social services and a special grant related to social services. So again, $95 million in upload, $50 million in grant clawback for a net benefit of about $45 million. 50 million, sorry, did I say? I'm sorry. So $95 million in upload benefit, 50 million, and grant clawback for a net benefit of $45 million. So again, that was a significant contribution towards the city being able to achieve these inflationary increases. And why I wanted to spend a little time on the experience 2008 to 2019 is we're seeing some very different factors affecting us in 2020. I spoke to provincial upload of a number of social services, and you'll see in 2020 and looking forward is we're having a bit of the opposite experience where the provincial government is expecting municipalities to bear a greater burden of a number of social services costs by shifting the ratio of funding, provincial and federal funding. As well, over this period, 2008 to 2019, we were recipients of some federal and provincial grants, and that favorably impacted us over this period. Market conditions would have affected us over that period, sometimes positively, sometimes negatively. Many of us remember the period of peak oil and the impact that had on fuel prices, and that would have been a driving factor to some of the pressures over this period. And again, there's fluctuations in market prices. Most recently, we've been discussing over the last few years is changes in the demand for recyclables as a commodity in Asia, more specifically in China, and that's having a material impact as it relates to our revenues. Our collective agreements would have been factors that would have affected our performance over this period. 2017, we undertook a restructuring in order to achieve the targets set out in 2017 of 1.1%, and that had a impact as it relates to our financial performance. Assessment growth, assessment appeals, assessment shifts. I know we're going to have some of those discussions not only later today, but over the coming months. That continues to have an impact as it relates to the residential tax increases. We've seen a very strong residential housing market that's caused some shifts between non-residential to residential, and even within the residential housing market, there's variability, not only across the city, but within each of your wards. There's variability as it relates to the changes in assessment. So those are just some examples, just to provide some context as to the last number of years leading up to 2020 and how various factors would have benefited or created pressures for the city of Hamilton, as well as what is changing in 2020 versus that time period. So as I mentioned at the start of this presentation, staff were before you in July with an outlook. At that time, we were forecasting a $62 million pressure, which represents a 6.7% residential tax increase. I'm happy to announce that our current position is approximately $52 million, which represents a 5.5% residential tax increase. And that, as you can see in the graphic, is a change of about $10 million or 1.2%. Two principal factors contributing to that $10 million change. In July, the messaging from the provincial government has suggested that there would be some 2019 and 2020 policy changes, which would represent a greater burden to municipalities. There was some retraction of some of those, some pausing of some of those policy changes. And for 2020, what staff are identifying as those impacts represent approximately $6.7 million of the $10 million reduction. In addition, over the period July to today, staff continue to refine the budget, to adjust some forecasts, and that represents a further reduction of approximately $3.3 million. So generally, it's the continued work of staff as it relates to our forecasting going into 2020, reviewing our in-year actuals versus our forecast to 2020, as well as the province stepping back from some of their previous policy changes. In terms of the 5.5%, you've seen this breakdown in the past, we break it down by city departments, boards and agencies, and capital financing. City departments, we're currently reflecting a 3.4% increase. That represents about $118. For boards and agencies, we're reflecting a 1% increase, approximately $34. And with respect to the capital financing, you'll recall at the front end of this presentation in July, we are forecasting 1.3%. We've refined our forecasts around capital financing, and our current position is 1.12%. And that represents a $45 impact. So again, all of these percentages represent in total a $196 impact for an average household. And that average household, again, the assumption is a property with an assessment of $358,600. So recognizing some assessments are higher, some assessments are lower, that's a citywide average. So again, assuming assessed value of $358,600, a 5.5% increase would represent an additional $196. If I break down the budget a little further, and I just want to spend a little time to describe each of the categories or themes as to what is driving that 5.5%. In the past, you would have heard me describe a maintenance budget. And a maintenance budget essentially describes continuing to provide the services at the service levels that we are providing today on a go-forward basis, inclusive of commitments such as collective bargaining commitments, as well as contractual obligations and inflationary pressures, for instance, around fuel or other commodities. We break down the pressures, approximately $12.5 million represents salary, wage, and benefits. Again, these are obligations under our collective agreements, as well as government benefits and employer benefits. And again, that is what we've traditionally described a maintenance budget pressure. There's a series of other accounts pressures. It could be contractual, such as some of the our winter control or waste collection. That represents, in addition to some of our other lines, other accounts, an additional $2.25 million. Beyond what's described in the graphic as maintenance are some extraordinary pressures going into 2020. And for the most part, committee would have received information in year with respect to these pressures. You would have recalled some months ago we brought a report forward that identified City of Hamilton as well as other municipalities are seeing significant increases in our risk management premiums. At the time when we presented the reports, we identified that the city, along with 9 of our other comparators, are seeing increases in risk management premiums in that 35 to 43% range increase. And for the City of Hamilton, that's where we're coming in at about a 40% increase in our risk management premiums. That represents a $2 million impact. What staff proposed through that in-year report is we are going to revisit some of the terms in our assurance policies. We'll look at our ability to assume risk through our deductibles, and we'll be revisiting some of those terms. And on a go-forward basis, we'll try to manage those risks. But again, by managing that $2 million pressure may represent a great additional risk to the corporation surrounding deductibles. So again, that is not necessarily unique to the City of Hamilton, but a 40% increase is unique as it relates to year-over-year increases. WSIB in 2018, at year end, we had a shortfall in our WSIB contributions. I believe it was about $2.8 million or $2.5 million. We're trending towards a shortfall in our 2019 forecast, north of $3 million. And what staff are suggesting is an additional $1.5 million in contributions towards our WSIB obligations. Computer software licensing, again, this isn't unique to the City of Hamilton. We're finding that some of the providers of software are transitioning their model. They're going from licenses to subscriptions. And that change in the model, service delivery model, represents an additional pressure to the City of Hamilton in 2020 of about $1.5 million. We've described these as somewhat extraordinary because of either market conditions, such as around the computer software licensing and insurance premiums, and then right-sizing our budget, such as in the case of WSIB. If you look at the salary, wages, other, and these three variables that we describe as extraordinary, these pressures represent just short of $20 million in pressures, or an additional 2% impact. So again, just trying to break down the 5.5% salary, wages, and these pressures represent 2% of the 5.5%. Beyond those categories and the $20 million in pressures, as I described, we're experiencing a very different relationship with the province of Ontario than historically over that 2008 to 2019 period. There have been some additional investments in the City of Hamilton. Notably, there was a commitment of $2.2 million for our dental funding for low-income seniors. Housing, there's a commitment in capital of approximately $2.9 million in housing, as well as a commitment of $1.2 million for neonatal ambulance unit. Yes, yeah, thankfully. Yeah, I'm glad they're transitioning beyond that stage. So beyond this graphic, I don't want to misrepresent what the investment has been. So those three areas, those three investments represent about $5.4 or $5.5 million. I'll note that those are commitments. Those are targeted funding that can't be used and are applied to reduce the levy. So those are commitments towards our dental program, our paramedics, as well as towards housing. And as well, it's a mix of capital and operating. That's not all operating impacts. What is challenging us going into 2020 beyond those incremental investments is the change in the funding relationship around services such as children's services, Ontario Works, and public health services. With respect to children's services, within the overall $70 million allocation that the province has committed is to Hamilton in 2020 around childcare services is $10 million that in 2019 was a $12 million provincial funding commitment. It was $12 million, 100% provincially funded. In 2020, the commitment is $10 million, reflecting a cost-sharing arrangement shifting from 100% provincial to 80% provincial, 20% municipal. So in order to preserve, if it's the will of committee to preserve that overall $12 million funding level, and that $2.6 million in additional local commitment would represent a subsidy to approximately 370 recipients in 2020. In order to preserve that level of service would require additional $2.6 million in levy commitment. So again, the province has held the line on that particular portion of the $70 million at $10 million. In 2019, it represented approximately $12 million. In order to preserve that level of service would require an additional $2.6 million in levy contribution. You'll recall, as it relates to Ontario Works, the province has held the line as it relates to their funding commitment to 2018 funding ratios or commitments, and that represents an additional $1.5 million pressure in 2020. And finally, public health services, you'll recall that the province is transitioning from their 75-25 provincial municipal ratio to 70-30. I'll point out that while it represents a $1.3 million pressure in 2020, I'll just remind you that part of the commitment was to cap the impact to municipalities at no greater than 10%. And so going forward in 2021, what we're identifying is a potential additional risk as it relates to public health, as it relates to that cap of approximately $1.4 million. So again, there is a change in terms of the relationship. That change reflects a higher expectation as it relates to municipalities cost sharing in a series of programs, including these three programs that are highlighted before you, and that represents an additional $5.4 million in pressures. Beyond those pressures is additional investments in our DARTS program. You'll see in this graphic is the budget assumes an additional just short of 98,000 trips for DARTS recipients in 2020, bringing total trips to approximately 885,000 trips. That the additional trips, as well as some contractual inflationary pressures, represents about $6.7 million in pressures in 2020. Also, you'll recall that there is an obligation with municipalities that with respect to Presto, it's operating around the fare obligation, and as we transition to more uptake as it relates to Presto payments is our obligation to Metrolinx, specifically with respect to Presto, is increasing. So you'll recall in 2018, staff identified that based on our multi-year forecast, is I believe out to 2027, is it would represent north of a $4 million increase in our obligation to Metrolinx as it relates to Presto. I'll point out that while it represents a forecast out to that period, if you look at the growth as it relates to the forecasted growth really accelerates right up to 2021-22. So most of that increase will come forward through future year budgets between 2020 and 2022. So that represents an additional $1.2 million in pressures. You'll recall through our earlier discussions around the infrastructure program, the intake program surrounding the transit stream is 2020 reflects the 5th year of our 10-year transit strategy. That 5th year is projected to contribute an additional 46,000 hours of service. Associated with that is some investments in rolling stock, in buses, as well as operators. So again, you'll see that for 2020, the pressure represents just short of $700,000 in operating impacts. Associated with that is an additional 35 full-time equivalent positions. And just as a reminder, it's a blend of last year's 30 FTEs that will be annualized in 2020, as well as a quarter of the 35 FTEs in 2020. So again, it's a blend of last year's enhancement as it relates to annualizing those positions, and I believe it represents only a quarter of the year for the 35 additional full-time equivalents. So again, just short of $700,000 in operating investments, pressures, that would represent an additional 46,000 service hours. You'll recall that when we were before you, some operating impacts associated with capital. Again, you'll recall that we were forecasting some capital pressures of about 1.3%. That is adjusted slightly, just short of about 1.2%. What's driving those are investments in our West Harbour, in our transit, and in our block funding. But above those investments are some operating impacts from previous capital projects. So as a reminder, when those assets come online is when the additional full-time equivalents and the operating impacts are reflected in the operating budget. So in total, we have approximately $3 million in operating impacts associated with previous capital projects. Of that $3 million, approximately $1.1 million is related to West Harbour projects that are being completed and approved in previous years. Our traffic management system, as well as a number of enhancements in traffic signals, represents an additional operating impact in 2020 of $800,000. Some investments in open space is contributing an additional $500,000 pressure in 2020. Our implementation of our multi-year IT strategy represents an additional $235,000 in operating impacts, and there's a series of smaller capital projects that make up the balance described as other. So in total, previously approved capital projects are contributing approximately $3 million in pressures as it relates to not only the positions required to support those programs or assets, but as well as the operating impacts associated with those assets. So whether it's around energy, around signals, or around managing our traffic management system. Again, our July forecast, our capital financing forecast assumed 1.3%. The forecast has been refined. We're currently sitting at 1.12% for capital financing. Some of the driving factors to that 1.12% is the opportunity to leverage federal and provincial funding as it relates to our transit strategy. You'll recall that Council approved a submission to senior levels of government asking for support for our transit program, more specifically our maintenance and storage facility, as well as some additional buses or rolling stock. For 2020, if that application were to be approved, it would require additional capital financing. That capital financing, namely debt, would have a servicing requirement that would represent a $1.8 million pressure in 2020, or about 0.2%. You may recall previous conversations around our development charge exemptions. We went through an extensive process as it relates to approving the background study and our DC bylaw. You'll also recall that under development charge exemptions, there are statutory obligations and then our discretionary programs. The $2 million represents an annual pressure to meet our statutory obligations as it relates to development charge exemptions. So again, there's a series of legislative requirements where municipalities are asked to subsidize or discount the cost of the services related to growth, and those statutory obligations represent a pressure of about $2 million. Also, you'll recall that staff brought before committee and council a strategy investment for office accommodations. That office accommodation strategy represents a pressure in 2020 of about $1.2 million, which represents a 0.14% increase. West Harbor, you'll recall, is a multi-year capital investment strategy for 2020. And again, these numbers are continuing to be reviewed as the forecast is being refined. But currently, we're assuming just short of a $300,000 capital financing pressure, which represents a 0.03% increase. And finally, what we've come to describe as our discretionary or block program represents additional 0.5%, and a 0.5% represents $4.3 million in additional funding. And that block or discretionary program goes principally towards maintaining our existing assets. It's putting roofs on our facilities, it's maintaining HVAC systems, it's providing investments into facilities, whether they're recreation, corporate facilities, in the past, long-term care facilities. It's what I describe, as others describe, a state of good repair. It's maintaining the roof on your home, it's maintaining the windows on your home, and that 0.5% is going towards trying to maintain our existing assets. And if a little further, how that 0.5% or $4.3 million is currently projected to come forward to committee, I believe in November for your deliberations, is an additional $2.9 million in roads, bridges, and sidewalks, additional $1 million for transit, and finally a $400,000 increase in parkland acquisition. So again, as it relates to the 0.5%, in additional block or discretionary funding, currently staff are assuming that that 4.3% will be distributed principally across those three assets. And what's driving the allocation to those three assets? You can see, and this has historically been presented to committee and councils, and I'll just point out that these values are 2012 dollars. So again, they haven't been adjusted for inflation. This is what we describe as our capital funding deficiency. And while we have a overall capital obligation deficiency of that $3 to $3.3 billion range, this is annually what the City of Hamilton should be investing towards state of good repair on our existing assets. And you can see that roads and bridges and traffic represent the lion's share of that $195 million, followed by our housing portfolio, and then you can see that a number of our other asset groups are identified here as well. I want to point out that as this information will continue to come before committee as soon as November, when we present our capital budget in November. But I'll just remind committee that because of provincial legislation, more specifically jobs, our infrastructure for jobs and prosperity, is you've approved a policy in July of this year surrounding asset management, and we're going to continue to have conversations with this council over the term of council, describing and getting committee and council to approve some service levels with respect to our asset groups, including our core and non-core asset groups. So again, that's a multi-year exercise over this term of council and leading into the next term of council. But the challenge that municipalities will have is that councils will have to arrive at a service level for assets with an associated financing plan. So again, this information will come before you at future dates as we continue to deliberate and staff present information to help inform you as to what those service levels are that you want to attain or retain, as well as the associated financing plans. And finally, another of the driving factors to our 2020 forecast is boards and agencies. With respect to Hamilton Police Services, previous years we've assumed a 5-year average, and so we've assumed that same 5-year average with Hamilton Police Services, which represents about $4.8 million of the $6 million value. Over and above that, what we've captured is in 2019, through the 2019 budget process, you approved a additional investment in complement, I believe $23 23 or 26 FTEs, 24 FTEs. The annualization of those, again, what was approved in 2019 were those, the funding for those positions with a July effective date. So now the balance of that, the remaining 6 months, affects the 2020 budget. So again, that represents an additional $1.2 million. So again, we're assuming a 5-year average, which would be $4.8 million, and the annualization of those 24 FTEs, which is additional $1.2 million. Conservation authorities, you'll recall that in the past we appealed the levies for the conservation authorities. We weren't successful with that appeal, and that represents an additional $2.5 million pressure in 2020. Libraries, based on the guideline, we're reflecting an increase in funding for the library board and library services of just short of $650,000, and other boards and agencies represent an additional $300,000 in pressures for a total of $9.5 million. So again, just wanting to describe and try to break down the 5.5% increase. So again, 2% of the 5.5% is maintenance and some extraordinary pressures. Additional pressures represent the provincial change in funding relationship, as well as a number of investments in transit, including DARTS, Presto, and fifth-year transit strategy, and finally a series of other investments. And those investments in total represent an additional $13 million, or 1.4%. And then there is a series of other pressures or investments that represent approximately $9.7 million, or 1.12%, as well as, I skipped a slide. This is the capital financing, which is 1.12%, and the 1.4% and the 2% is how we arrive at the 5.5%. Also want to point out, I mentioned previously the assessment and reassessment shifts. And so assessment, I'll just remind committee, we're in the final year of the 4-year phase-in around reassessment. And as in previous years, there will be different impacts across the city, as in the previous 3 years, where there will be additional pressures relative to the average impact will be, once again, wards 1, 2, and 3 principally, a bit as well as 4, and that represents an additional 1.6%. So in addition to the, if council were to approve a 5.5%, those wards would on average add an additional 1.6%. Offsetting that is there are some reductions as a result of reassessment in wards 12 and 13. I believe it's a 0.3 or 0.4% reduction as a result of reassessment. So different impacts across the city, but as in previous years, it's principally wards 1, 2, and 3 that are impacted because of reassessment. And again, this is the final year of year 4, and then we enter into a new 4-year reassessment period starting in 2021. So again, 2020 represents year 4 of a 4-year phased-in reassessment. So again, we sit at about a $52 million pressure increase, representing 5.5%. As in the previous directions from council, you set 3 scenarios, 4.6%, 3.6%, and 2.6%. To achieve a 4.6% would require an additional $8.3 million in savings efficiencies. To achieve a 3.6% increase would represent an additional $17 million in savings and efficiencies. And finally, to achieve a 2.6% increase would represent an additional $25.7 million in savings and efficiencies. You'll recall earlier in the presentation, I had that time series of 2008 to 2019, just in terms of context setting as it relates to these scenarios. I'll remind committee in 2017 was the last time that we undertook such an exercise, and we eliminated 83 FTEs in 2017, which represented about $11 million in savings and efficiencies. So that provides you just some sense as to the level of service or service level adjustments that would be required to achieve the three scenarios that are before you. So with respect to the approach that staff are taking around the 4.6% scenario, we are looking at a number of options that we've grouped under the three categories: financials, revenues, as well as services. So under financials is we're looking at utilizing reserves in part to achieve the reduction. I'll say that this isn't a sustainable strategy. For instance, under the 4.6%, we would be looking at mitigating some of the public health impacts. Our flexibility is we have just short of 300,000, about 278,000 in our public health reserve, and that could be exhausted in 2020 to help to mitigate some of the provincial funding changes as it relates to public health. As well as there are, as a result of the ISIP intake program, there's opportunities to reduce our forecasted level of investment into our transit reserve. If we're successful with the ask as it relates to our maintenance and storage facility, as well as our transit rolling stock, it could alleviate some pressures as it relates to contribution to reserves in transit. So again, it's not only drawing from reserves, but if we're successful in leveraging funding from senior levels of government, it could reduce the need to invest in some of these reserves as we're leveraging funding from external sources. We're looking at a series of revenues. You'll recall in the guideline that you approved was a 3% benchmark, with as well as pursuing increases over and above 3% in situations where the market or our competitive position would justify it. So again, staff are looking across our user fee bylaw, looking at fees, not only existing fees, but the potential for new fees. And just as an example, in previous years, we've increased fees such as our parking fees. So again, that's one option, as well as we're looking at options as it relates to our recreation fees as well. So in that 3 to 5% range as it relates to our recreation fees. As well, beyond revenues, we're looking at reductions that we would describe as having potential impacts as our ability to respond to information requests or inquiries. So these are positions that we rely upon as it relates to potential in-year requests that arise and responding to committee and council as it relates to your request. So again, there's a number of reductions that could impact that, as well as some policy work and some strategic development work that would have an impact on a go-forward basis. We're also looking at our facilities and programs. So we're looking across our service levels and our comparators to see where we are providing services at a higher level than our comparator municipalities, or where there may not be full utilization of our services or facilities. So as it relates to opportunities to reduce services and align them with our comparator municipalities, or the possibility of decommissioning and divesting of facilities, and I should say facilities and or land. So some of those scenarios create one-time revenue sources, but again, as it relates to the targets, we're trying to exhaust all of our options beyond just looking at reducing services and service levels, but leveraging some of our assets and potentially divesting in some of our assets. As well as we're looking at aligning service levels as it relates to provincial funding. And so again, this morning you would have heard me speak to 3 areas where the province is changing their funding ratios. In all of those areas, there isn't necessarily an opportunity in all 3 areas to reduce local contribution, but again, staff are looking at areas to reduce the funding level according to provincial funding, and I would say by extension that does look at discretionary programs as well. And finally is, as in the case at senior levels of government, is we have some discretionary grant funding that we provide to external agencies, and that may be an option as it relates to achieving the 4.6% scenario. So again, the purpose for today is to describe the approach that staff are taking with respect to the mitigation actions and seek your input as to whether or not this aligns with your expectations or if there are other areas that you wish us to pursue going forward as we lead into the preparation of the budget book and our deliberations in the new year. Beyond all of these potential actions, so the 3.6 scenario includes all of these. In addition to those, is looking at further increases in user fees and the potential introduction of new fees and charges. So there are certain goods or services that we provide to residents at no charge. So whether it's our blue boxes, we waive fees for some recipients. So we waive some transit fees for some recipients through some of our programs. To achieve the 3.6% scenario, we would be bringing forward options surrounding eliminating some of those exemptions around fees and introducing some new fees or charges. As well is looking further down the list of our facilities, as well as looking at our services and service levels and identifying where there are discretionary budgets that council has some authority over affecting. So again, it's not just these 3 bullet points under the 3.6 scenario. It's what's required to achieve 4.6, and going further is pursuing some additional revenue increases and new fees and charges, as well as going a little further deeper as it relates to looking at divesting in assets and closing some of our facilities and reducing some of our service levels. So again, the intent for today was to just provide committee some sense to as it relates to the approach that staff are taking under these 2 scenarios, and to seek your input as it relates to whether this aligns with expectations or whether we should be pursuing some additional opportunities. As I stated at the front end of this presentation, we've embarked on a multi-year budget process, so I didn't want to focus exclusively on 2020. I wanted to give you some sense as to what staff see on the horizon as it relates to 2021 and 2022. We spent some time to describe the provincial policy changes that will affect us in 2020. There's going to be some continuation potentially of those in 2021-22. I mentioned public health, so public health, again, one of the mitigating measures that the provincial government was they capped the change in the shift of 70-30 to 75-25 at no greater than 10%. And if that's not continued, that while that was a one-time commitment, if that were not to continue in 2021, I believe the exposure risk is an additional $1.4 million in 2021. As well as the province has messaged some, again, changes in the cost sharing around the administrative costs of some of our services. So where administrative costs were cost shared is reducing the provincial contribution towards that cost sharing. So municipalities absorbing more of the burden as it relates to the administrative costs of some of those services. So again, the theme around downloading we are expecting will continue beyond 2020. We don't know to what degree, but again, we just wanted to put that on your roadmap going forward. Capital funding, as I mentioned, this is really an opportunity as it relates to not only our transit requests, but you recall we made a series of requests as it relates to culture, community and recreation facilities. If those applications were to be approved, some of those projects are accelerated projects that aren't currently in our operating forecast that would represent additional operating impacts. So again, the opportunity is leveraging the investment, the capital investment, which is significant. It would just represent some additional operating pressures in future years around those facilities. You'll recall in July, we identified a council referred item, and that was the fire transit plan. It wasn't part of this presentation. I should point out, I apologize, I should have made it clear, the 5.5% does not include council referred issues. So again, the fire 10-year service delivery plan represents a council referred item that will come before you at future committee meetings. And again, that's a multi-year plan. And so beyond 2020 is potential investments as it relates to, in part, our growing community, but as well as the service levels to sustain our fire program. And again, that would represent some additional pressures in 2021, as would the multi-year paramedic strategy that would represent some potential pressures in 2021. The continuation, again, 2020 represents year 5 of the transit strategy. It's assuming that year 5 is implemented in 2020, is natural to assume that staff would bring forward year 6 of that transit strategy in 2021. There's a series of housing investments that will be before you in the coming weeks as part of the capital program. And again, these are opportunities in part on leveraging funding from senior levels of government, as well as commitments that this council has made with respect to revitalizing not only housing stock, but neighborhoods, Roxborough being one. That development will represent some required investments in 2021 on the operating and as well on the development charge exemption side. So about just south of, just short of $500,000 on operating, and I believe $2.1 million in exemptions. As well is the opportunity around the National Housing Strategy, and that will be before you in the coming weeks as part of the capital budget deliberations. As well as beyond development charge exemptions, you would have heard me say that in the past we provided exemptions, but we haven't funded those exemptions. We have about $60 million in development charge exemptions that need to be funded, and staff will bring forward a financing strategy on how to address that development charge liability in 2020. And finally, Bill 108, the change in regime of soft services around development charges, shifting to community benefit charges. We don't know yet what that represents, so it's just identified as an unknown right now. But again, the risk is that there's further transfer of a burden as it relates to growth from growth onto existing taxpayers and ratepayers, and that may represent a pressure in 2021. So just providing you some sense of beyond 2020, really hoping that committee and council will have an appreciation that we need to really be looking beyond 2020 and position ourselves not only with 2020 but going into 2021 through the balance of these deliberations. So final slides is just where we're at and our roadmap as it relates to the 2020 budget process. Again, this is our check-in with you as it relates to the mitigation strategy. Will be before you late November, early December, both on the rate budget as well as our 2020 tax capital supported budget, and finally our user fees. Then our gift to council will be before our holiday shutdown, as we'll disseminate the budget books, and that is our gift to you before the holidays. And we'll reconvene after the holidays and provide a further overview on our tax operating, as well as the departmental presentations early in the new year. You'll see boards and agencies is scheduled for 2 days on the 21st and 23rd of January. As per the past few years, we have a dedicated transit day. given that is a driving factor to our 2020 budget and beyond, and given that there's been a series of questions around transit, is set for January 24th. As I mentioned, departmental presentations through the latter part of January into February, and then we have a number of days set aside for budget, 1 day for budget delegations, February 10th, and then a number of days set aside for further budget deliberations, including any council-referred items, as well as any potential enhancements that may come forward through the budget process. So just as a reminder as to our budget process, we're still early stages, and we'll be before you in about a month's time around the rates and our tax-supported capital and our user fee report. And through the chair, happy to answer any questions that committee might have.
And thank you, Mike. Feel free to have a seat if you'd like. So we have Councillor Farr, Councillor Wilson, Councillor Jackson. Councillor Farr.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mike. I'm really looking forward to this budget process. Tom Hewiston was gracious enough, looking at slide 4, Mike. I asked him, I'm interested, politically, just to look at by term what our averages were, and he did it for me real quick. So that term from 2011 through 2014, the average was 1.3. No austerity, as you mentioned off the top. And then the last term, which we concluded last year, was, I think he said, 1.9. Anyway, the average was 1.7, which was over 2 terms. So politically, looking at it politically, of council passed, we were essentially, through you, Chair, at inflation. Correct?
So through the chair. So the short answer is yes. The longer extended answer is no, because frankly, effectively is you have inflation somewhere in that 1.8% range. And so effectively we're absorbing through increases equivalent to inflation, effectively we're absorbing inflation. So through each budget process is when you just, in terms of today's presentation, would have seen as it relates to our collective agreement and our employer and government benefits, that's a $12.5 million pressure. If we're absorbing inflation, that means we're mitigating that $12.5 million through efficiencies. So again, each and every budget process, staff look at what we describe as maintenance budgets, but they aren't maintenance budgets in that we're just assuming status quo as it relates to how we deliver services. We continue to look for some efficiencies and savings through the budget submissions that come before you. So short answer is yes, we're coming in at inflation, but again, by coming in at inflation, that means we're mitigating some of the pressures, such as our collective agreement obligations.
Madam Chair, it was actually, and thanks, Tom, I called it up. It's 2.1% for that term that started October 2014, the average over 4 years, and 1.3 that started October 2010. Through you, Chair, we often look, and we probably will later on. I'm not expecting, actually, short answers are fine here today, Mike. On most of my questions, I'm sure we could get some report back, and I'm obviously fine with that. But we look at our comparators, and my recollection over the budget years is that, really only Windsor, maybe there was another city, was able to come under what our averages were. And this is the last historic question. Windsor, as I recollect as well, did have austerity budgets when they sort of beat us out on the average.
So through the chair, yes. And again, I think it's important to note is each municipality is in a different position and has had a very different journey over this period. And recognizing what was Windsor's driving reason for austerity budgets is they went through a significant economic downturn. We were all affected in 08 and 09 from the recession, but Windsor did not necessarily rebound, more specifically in their auto manufacturing sector. So when you lose your portion, a significant portion of your revenue base because of restructuring and changes in valuation, that erodes your revenues to fund programs. That was a driving factor, and there's swings. You know, in the 80s, might have been 80s, early 90s, Windsor, bit of a windfall through a casino, changes in policy around passports, smoking, changes in dollar valuations, reduced the number of visitors, and Windsor saw a big reduction in the valuation of their casino in Windsor that further eroded at their revenue base. So again, we all have had different journeys as it relates to what's caused. In the city of Hamilton, we've had significant increases in valuation in our properties, which has been a benefit to property owners, caused some shifts as it relates to across the city. We've had assessment growth ranging from that 0.8 to 1.6% net assessment growth. Along with that has been some challenges for us as well around assessment growth. Some of the offsets to the assessment growth has been the change in the retail sector. Previous councils I would have reported, and maybe to this council as well, is we've seen erosion in our commercial and more specifically in our retail base. As big box retail are competing, they're having to provide a variety of goods that represents lower margins in part for them. So as a grocer, a large grocer, they're now having to compete with the Walmarts, meaning they're introducing clothing lines into grocery stores, which have different margins. And assessments reflect income. And when you are introducing now a mix of goods that generates less income, that represents a decline in the valuations, which represents a decline in that sector to us in terms of tax dollars, which represents a shift. So again, that 5.5% current position, that reflects a 0.5% shift of tax burden from our commercial sector onto our residential sector because of the higher increase in valuation of residential properties over the last 4 years versus the commercial properties. So again, we've as well impacted, and I would say we're going to continue to be impacted by the retail sector. I expect I'll be before you in the new year with some challenging news with respect to further assessment appeals in the retail sector, and I'm not sure we fully realized the impact of e-commerce as it relates to the retail sector as well.
Thanks. Slide 7 through you, Chair. Boards and agencies, save for conservation authorities, police, and library, I think it only accounts for $300K so quickly. Through you, Chair, are we hearing from any of these boards and agencies where we're asking for the 0% increase that they're going to have some challenges?
So through the chair, I don't believe we formally heard from the conservation authorities what we've identified as.
Not the ones where we sit. The ones where we've asked for 2. So I think it works out to $300K or something. The boards and agencies were not the conservation authorities, not the libraries, not the police board, but the ones where we've requested a 0% increase. Those boards and agencies. Any have you heard from them at all?
So through the chair, we haven't heard that that represents a challenge. But again, okay, it's silent, so I'm not sure whether to assume that it's not going to be a challenge, or we will hear in the new year that they are facing challenges with respect to that guideline.
Thank you, Mike. Slide 11, second bullet, traffic management signaling. This is the budget, one of the budget driver pages. So through you to whomever, maybe you, Mike, and maybe I can just ask that next we meet, we could examine or let me know whether or not we couldn't just eliminate the $800K by utilizing red light camera reserve, unless I can get an answer for that now through you. If there's some policy that says we cannot. Through you to Mike or Dan or whomever.
So through the chair, we can take that away. So again, these are ongoing costs. So while it's reflected as a pressure, these are ongoing costs as it relates to additional traffic signals, as well as our traffic operations center, some historical investments in our traffic operations center. So we can take that away and look at the recognizing that there are some, as well as some potential investments going forward that we may draw on the red light camera reserve. We can look at the capacity of that reserve.
Thanks, Mike. Madam Chair, slide 18, just a few more questions here. On 18 and 19, basically. you have a point on 19, slide 19 at the end. I think you skimmed over it. I don't know if you mentioned, I may have missed it. It says at the bottom in the black bar there, to achieve 3.6, all actions on 4.6% list, plus the list above is needed. But my problem is understanding, because you also used you said, at one point you said, we're going to have to do some of it. And I'm trying to figure out between the sum and the all on these two pages, because there's some bullets here where you're suggesting close underutilized facilities as an example. Close all underutilized facilities to achieve what you're suggesting in the black bar here, or some, and if it's some, which ones? I know we can't answer that in-depthly today, but how do we get a handle on
Yeah.
it?
So through the chair, number of questions here. So maybe I'll start with the first question about what does the black bar represent? So again, to achieve a 4.6% residential increase would require $8.3 million in efficiencies. So staff have embarked on identifying $8.3 million in potential efficiencies, taking this approach and these principles. Now, to achieve a 3.6 would require that $8.3 million in options and an additional $9 million in further efficiencies. And that's what we are suggesting it would be. This list of potential efficiencies and a further $9 million based on this approach.
Okay, so the list is your guideline,
Yes.
essentially. Okay, that answers my question, thank you. On the financials, reduced contributions to reserves, when you offer stuff like this, and which impacts long-term financial planning, does it also impact that AA plus rating we just received? Do these kinds of cuts affect that?
So through the chair, in general, is given the magnitude of some of the early options, I would say it won't compromise. Those options alone will not compromise the AA plus credit rating. I'll note that AA plus credit rating reflects strong liquidity, but what's referred to as liquidity is essentially our reserves as well as our cash on hand, as cash in the bank. So again, if we continue to erode at the reserves, is over the long run, it may affect the AA plus credit rating, but there's other factors as well. Debt being one of those other factors, and I know we're going to discuss our debt levels as part of the capital budget process.
Okay, awesome. Yes or no, through you, Chair, we're going to get an update on revenue generation. I see those billboards along the link are quite actively flicking to different ads and stuff like that. When does that happen?
So through the chair, that would be part of the departmental budget presentations, the CMO departmental budget.
And finally, I'm just curious, second bullet on slide 18 under services, reduce capability for policy work, including in your requests from council. Have we ever measured just the cost of that through you, Chair?
So,
When we come up with these crazy ideas and sequester 6 managers and take up a lot of time and money to get stuff done year in, year out?
So through the chair, first off, I didn't describe the ideas as crazy ideas, but we are, SLT are compiling a list of outstanding business item lists, and we need to undertake some work to prioritize that list. We have having had a quick glance of that list, I believe we're sitting just as it relates to GIC at a 27-page list. And so we need to prioritize those outstanding business items, given that the capacity is not there to deliver on all of those. And what we're identifying is beyond that historical list is as new issues arise, is we may have to turn to reserves, external resources. If we mitigate through eliminating some of that capacity in future years, if these requests arise, we may have to leverage outside expertise to satisfy committee and council's expectations.
Thank you. Okay, thank you. Councillor Wilson.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mike, very much for that presentation. I just had a few general high-level questions. part of your narrative this morning has been a change in our sort of financial or social contract with the provincial government, and you noted from 2008 to 2017, we saw a pattern of uploading in the form of $95 million, granted with $50 million in grant clawbacks. Part of your other narrative was talking about our ability to pay across the city for our citizens, given you referenced our stagnant wage increases compared to the province.
Can you please speak into the microphone, please? I didn't hear the last sentence, actually. Sorry.
That's okay. I'm just trying to get a sense of sort of the high-level world in which Hamilton's having to work now. So my question to Mike is, have we done any analysis within this new compact with this new provincial government that is doesn't appear to be going into a practice of uploading? They seem to be shifting to a practice of downloading. What the impact comparatively is going to be on Hamilton compared to maybe some other municipalities in Ontario, given our demographic profile. Do we have that? Because I think that would be of assistance to certainly me and maybe the municipality in our intergovernmental relations, that this impact may be different in York compared to that of Hamilton.
So through the chair, I would say we don't have it all captured through one report or a fact sheet. I think it's captured through a series of pieces of information. You're going to see through the capital budget process some significant investments in housing on a go-forward basis towards maintaining our existing or replenishing our existing housing stock, as well as some incremental. And why I mentioned housing is, yes, there was a period of provincial upload of programs such as Ontario Drug Benefit, Ontario Disability Support Program, Ontario Works, but the one program that the province did not move on was housing. When housing was devolved to municipalities in 2002, if we compare 2018-19 with 2002, locally on the operating budget side, we're investing probably $17 million more, probably 50% more than what was provided to the municipality in base funding back in 2002. So as it relates to ability to pay or affordability, that continues to be an area of priority, but as well, it creates some competitive tension for us relative to other municipalities that may not have the legacy exposure around aged housing stock and needing to replenish social housing stock, but as well as wanting to make some investments towards the waiting list and trying to move that needle as it relates to housing shortages, affordable housing. So as it relates to the affordability, I would say in part, as I mentioned this morning, past councils were focused on trying to reduce that gap that we had over our comparator municipalities. We made some inroads with reducing that gap, but we made it through containing the tax increases. Household income, because we look at tax relative to household income, and household income has not changed very much in Hamilton. The difference, the gap versus our comparators. I've just recently looked at the figures. We range 12 to 14% lower than our comparators, and that's been the average since 2008.
The reason I'm asking is, thank you very much for that. My experience has been whenever we re-enter a period of downloading. The senior order of government will argue one thing in terms of conveniently sometimes its macro impact, whereas its more specific impact, in this case in relation to Hamilton, could be very different. And I think sometimes for residents, including myself, we can get confused by assertions on one hand versus assertions on the other hand in terms of municipality. And you referenced 2002, and I just respectfully would say that at that time, the senior order of government was very strongly claiming that its actions on downloading were revenue neutral. And they may have been revenue neutral overall. They were not revenue neutral to Hamilton because of our social housing component, our ability to pay, and the age of our infrastructure. And I think it would be very important for us moving forward to make sure that we are able to demonstrate that those provincial policy decisions, particularly for our MPPs, are not the same in their impact. So that's one point or question I wanted to ask you. The second one is a little bit of a micro one. In 2008, you were referencing, in trying to explain that 3.8 bar, you did reference the Hamilton Police Service in that. And just as terms of background of trying to understand that police budget, what was the rationale for that impact, that increase? Significant increase for that year, if you recall. Through you, Madam Chair.
So through the chair, I'd have to go back. It was a $4 million increase to boards and agencies, and as I recall, it was Hamilton Police Services, but I'd have to see whether or not it was a complement or right-sizing budget or other inflationary pressures in 2008. We would have that information. We'll just have to go back into the archive and pull that information out. And if I head to your first question, I'll just highlight that it's not a new conversation, I think, what the councillor is referring to. We had this conversation in previous years when Hamilton was excluded out of the social pool. The GTA social pool is, we were average. I made reference to a $50 million grant clawback. A majority of that was referred to a social program grant that was in excess of $30 million. And I think at one time we were receiving $17 million in what was referred to as a special grant. And that came about through some work of then elected officials and staff that highlighted Hamilton's uncompetitive position as it relates to some burdens around social services. So again, I would say it's not necessarily a new conversation. I would say it's new in that we've gone through an extended period of uploading, but we may find ourselves back in having to do that analysis as to how these policy changes are impacting Hamilton relative to comparative municipalities. And as well, I would highlight to a previous point I made, which I'm hoping will be part of our presentation to you in January, is I made reference to erosion in the non-residential sector. When I look across the province as a whole over an extended period of time, is across the province we've seen some greater erosion in the non-residential assessment base that's causing a shift onto the residential base. So we have many factors that we need to further investigate and report back to committee. And I would suggest that there likely be some takeaways and some additional efforts as it relates to communicating that, not only with senior levels of government, but with the community as well.
Thank you, Mike. Further to the police budget, you referenced asks for complement increases. What happens when the police are not able to fill those complements in terms of the monies that they have?
So through the chair, I don't know how they reflect it. So city departments, we reported as part of our vacancy target. So committee and council has set a $4.5 million what we refer to as a vacancy target. or gapping target. And that reflects vacancies that may be a maternity leave, it may be someone has successful externally, so they've left the organization, or internally, which causes some cascading. They leave their position, they vacate their position. So the target that council has set is $4.5 million towards reducing the levy. So we assume a $4.5 million saving as it relates to vacancies, and we reduce the levy to that figure. And we track that now departmentally. Each department has a target, and we report and track that. I don't know in the case of Hamilton Police Services whether or not they have a target, whether they've looked historically what their vacancies are. And but what I would suggest is that vacancy, if they do have vacancies, what that does is it affects their year-end reporting, and in the past number of years, it might have affected the surpluses they've had in previous years.
Yeah, and thank you, Mike, through you, Madam Chair, just in my very simplistic accounting mind, in my conversations with respect to issues in Ward 1, I'm being told that they're not able to fill their complements, but they're receiving monies for complements, and I'm just wondering what happens to those municipal dollars when they go to the police and they're can't be used or not being used.
So through the chair, that would then, assuming that they arrive at year end with a surplus, that would form part of their surplus if they had gapping, assuming that they don't have other offsetting pressures. They may have facility pressures or other offsetting, but that would form part of their surplus. And our practice at the City of Hamilton for boards such as police and library is any year-end surpluses go to their tax stabilization reserves, and or in the case of library, it goes, I think, in part to their capital reserve. So again, if they report a year-end surplus, our practice is they retain that year-end surplus, and that has to go to their tax stabilization reserve. They too have a tax stabilization reserve.
Thank you. One more question, Mike. You started your presentation by talking about principles, and this really isn't a loaded question because I am trying to understand on a move forward basis, and looking at your graphs, what were the principles that were guiding all those budget discussions since 2008? Like, what principles guide us when we're making these decisions?
So through the chair, since 2008 is the areas where previous councils have targeted some limited financial capacity has typically been in transit and paramedic services, as well as some other areas. But a driving factor was tax competitiveness. So that 2% on average the 2% on average increase, the driving factor to that was trying to affect in a positive way our tax competitiveness. And I should also point out is our financial position. So we did make efforts to improve our financial position. We reversed some previous practices where we improved our reserve positions, our funding balances and reserves. We implemented some policies around debt, and we tried to manage our debt. And the driving factor to that was one of council's strategic priorities was to retain or improve our credit rating. So we saw 2 upgrades in our credit rating and our financial position over, I believe, 2000. I'll get the years wrong, but somewhere in the period, I think of 2014 to 2017. So again, tax competitiveness was one of the priorities. Some investments into some targeted programs, as well as some efforts to improve our financial position as well.
Thank you. That was very helpful. So is it fair to say, through you, Madam Chair, that you haven't been provided with those principles to guide this term of council's budget deliberations?
So through the chair, I will say that in previous years, council has been focused on not only preserving services and service levels and affecting our tax competitiveness, but making some incremental investments. So in previous years, the guideline from council was to achieve a 0% tax increase and not affect services and service levels. So council was focused on preserving services and service levels with making some incremental investments in some targeted programs. I would say that was our driving, that was the direction that staff took as it relates to preparing some of our historical budgets.
Thank you. One final question through you, Madam Chair. Just so I understood what you were speaking to my colleague about on page 19 and 18, I take it you're not suggesting that we can't sort of mix these opportunities, if you will, up. So we could include this, the possibility that's set out on page 19 in terms of finding new revenues for services that traditionally we provided at no charge. We could include, not necessarily say we're going to head to a 3.6 target, but we could include these measures in this other basket, if you will, that's set on page 18.
Yeah. So through the chair, I would say it's like baking a cake. There isn't a perfect recipe to what I would suggest is staff are pursuing a variety or mix of options, and so that will be comprised of revenues, new revenues, increases to revenues. It would be comprised of what I would refer as structural change, reducing services or service levels, as well as looking at potentially what may be non-sustainable, but nevertheless positive options, such as divesting of land and or facilities. So that may create a one-time cash investment to help us through 2020 or 2021. So again, while we're very focused on sustainable measures, we shouldn't necessarily exhaust some opportunities such as divesting facilities and or land.
Thank you, and I have one final question, Madam Chair. How will, in terms of the capital budget, how will that budget be informed by this council's declaration of a climate emergency in terms of options? How will we see that played out in the budget that will be before us? Thank you, Madam Chair.
So through the chair, I know that you'll see a number of investments that will further previous work as it relates to reducing, for instance, greenhouse gas. So whether that's in our transit portfolio around a greener fleet, whether that's towards retrofitting facilities that reduces our carbon footprint, there will be some opportunities for investments that have a positive impact, environmental impact on this community. I want to manage expectations. As in past years, is a significant portion of the capital budget goes towards maintaining our existing assets. And so what's referred to as state of good repair. And given our infrastructure deficit, is the flexibility to redirect funding is somewhat limited as we're facing challenges. For one asset group is around our facilities. We have some challenges with regards to roofs that could have an impact on our program delivery and those facilities. So our flexibility to make some investments in other areas are limited because of the backlog that we have with respect to our existing assets. So I just want to try to manage expectations. You'll see in late November a multi-year capital plan that will have some positive impacts, environmental impacts locally. But again, a significant portion of that budget goes towards maintaining our existing assets.
Thank you. Thank you. And Councillor Jackson, before, though, I have a motion here for Mike to bring in his famous homemade cake at the next budget meeting. Councillor Jackson.
Thanks, Madam Deputy Mayor. And General Manager, as always, thank you for the early preview of the 2020 budget. As grim as it may be at this preview time, we shall overcome together if we maintain some sensibility and collective support across our community. I think we ended up, if I recall, at 2.2%, Mike, in 2019, even though we started at a higher number. So today we're sitting at 5.5, which obviously, might as well just throw it out there to begin with, Madam Deputy Mayor, that's unacceptable for me. However, just some quick comments and then some questions for clarity to Mike, Madam Deputy Mayor. I've always maintained over the years, saying to my constituents, you want somebody slash and burn, I'm not your representative. If you want somebody to do their darndest to get the best value for the property taxes you pay, for the programs, services, and projects that you feel are important to you, I'll do my very best. And I think it's a balance that we have to try individually and collectively to maintain between tax increases at a reasonable level and whatever service levels will be forthcoming. So with that opening remark, Mike, have you factored in at all, or I know you mentioned, I think earlier to Councillor Farr about departmentally, each department will mention about possible revenues, but shouldn't you, I would hope you would at future GICs where we are here all as one council colleagues, that the Panattoni announcements recently at the airport, the DHL's 100 million, Walters Group in my area, 250,000 square foot expansion, bringing in, I estimate, close to another $1 million in tax revenue along with good paying jobs. When will the public see that, Mike, so that wherever we may land 6 months from now for a tax increase in 2020, we can show our community the efforts from an economic development standpoint, and that wherever the tax number ends up being, Madam Deputy Mayor, it could have been even worse if it wasn't for efforts of et cetera, et cetera. Through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, please, Mike.
So through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, I'll point out our current 5.5% position assumes 1% assessment growth. And so that's been our previous practice, and through the future deliberations, we'll continue to refine that number. Our assessment roll, our final assessment roll, I believe, is the second Tuesday in December that we get our final assessment roll. And so staff, after the holiday shutdown in January, we'll start to review that, and we typically refine that 1% assumption in February as we approach the end of our budget deliberation. So in the past, that's ranged, the net has ranged from 0.8 to 1.6%. And as I mentioned, I expect we're going to continue to see some challenges in some sectors, eroding some of that gross residential or gross assessment figure. So again, while our strongest year was 1.6, in terms of gross terms, it might have been 1.8, 1.9, but because of successful assessment appeals or reassessment, there's some erosion to that. I also want to point out to the councillor's question is, as we've reported in the past and we will report going forward through this budget process, is there is always a lag between what is reported in terms of building permits and assessment. And so building permits is at a very early stage as it relates to a development. An assessment does not typically affect the municipality until it could be up to, it's not typically up to 2 years, but it could be up to 2 years post-occupancy permit. So there's a lag between what is announced today and when we see the assessment growth of future years. But again, I would suggest some of that positive trending in the past reflects some of the historical strength we've seen in building permits. And my final point I'd like to make is not all activity that is reflected in building permits is reflected in assessment growth. Let me give you an example. If a large non-residential development makes a $10 million investment in their HVAC system, that has no impact as it relates to their assessed value. And so in terms of building permits, that is factored in. Institutional developments are factored into the building permit value. That doesn't have an impact in terms of assessment and property tax benefit. So we try to reconcile, and again, that information will be part of our deliberations going forward.
Thanks, Mike. So maybe you could also, Mike, even though the impact of the Panattoni, the DHL, Walters Group, and many others, small, mid, and large, is there a way that you can capture the trending ones that, although we'll set our budget for 2020, they may not impact it favorably in the next 6 months, but you could tell both the community and council, folks, in another year or two, in light of what's trending, in light of recent announcements, we hope that there'll be those favorable impacts as well to this degree. Through you, Mr. Mayor, please.
So through you, Mr. Mayor, we can endeavor to do that. Typically in the report, we identify which developments are driving, and so we'll try to align that, you know, that might have been a development that was announced in 2017 that is affecting us as it relates to assessment in 2020, and then we can use that information to project going forward.
Including all the great restoration going on in the core as well. That's great. Thank you, Mike, for that. Mr. Mayor, Mike, does this at all, could you turn to, when you get a moment, slide 18 will be a couple of my questions to you. Does this presentation at all include the potential waste new contract that might impact $2.5 million a year? Mr. Mayor, through you.
So through you, Mr. Mayor, I'll turn to Dan or Brian in terms of what's reflected in that 5.5%, whether or not, I'm not sure if the councillor's question relates to the.
That's fine. That would be good if I could know at least, is that included or is that something additional we may have to deal with depending on council's ultimate decision, Mr. Mayor, through you.
I think Dan's itching to answer that one. Or Brian.
Yeah, so through the mayor, yeah, so that's included in the 5.5% increase that we have built in right now.
The 2.5%, the $2.5 million a year is, Brian.
Through the chair, correct.
Okay, thank you. Darts delegation, Mike, Transit Day is January 24th, I believe. Just want to make sure that we don't have to struggle or plead. Will Darts be part and parcel of Transit Day? Will it be a separate day? Will it come in under boards and agencies? Just want to know well in advance, Mr. Mayor.
So through you, Mr. Mayor, we're in the hands of committee. Darts is a contracted service, and in the past they formed part of the presentation, and in some years they haven't been part of the presentation. So again, we're in the hands of committee whether or not you wish Darts to be part of the presentations on Transit Day or not.
Thank you.
For me, Mr. Mayor, between you, Mike, Debbie, Delvedove, Stephanie, and city clerks, I'll let you folks work it out and where my colleagues want it. I think it would be, so many questions come up about paratransit during Transit Day. So to me, it's logical that both would be, but I'm not here to take away from our conventional Transit Day of mainly our HSR public transit system, Mr. Mayor. I'll leave it between Mike and clerks and the director of HSR, and obviously the executive director of DARTS to figure out the best time to come in. I just don't want them coming in under the normal boards and agencies and the 5-minute presentations where I know there's going to be a lot of questions. So Mike, I'll let you take that under advisement, please. On slide 18, yeah, Transit Day is January 24th. Thank you. Now, Mike, and to my council colleagues, fairly new on council, we just need, if we're going down a path of potential service reductions and or eliminations, Mr. Mayor, we need truthfulness and we need transparency across the board. And the truthfulness and transparency will start with departments. And what I mean by that, Mike, and I'll hearken back to the first term of the amalgamated city, quick story. I hope all my colleagues enjoy my stories once in a while. Thank you. Anyways, thank you. During that first term, real fast, the former manager in Public Works at that time, a manager in Public Works at that time said, Council, we can save you $3 million on the snow clearing budget. And we went, and all of us went, that's fantastic, wonderful. And of course, the first snowfall that came, I had many of my constituents calling, complaining, because they were slipping and sliding all the way down the Sherman Cut because the snow wasn't cleared after the snow fell. And usually the Sherman Cut, Mr. Mayor, as you know, is running water because all our escarpment passes have to be running water. Otherwise, we have lots of rear ends and accidents occurring. So at the following council meeting, somebody like the Ward 6 councillor asked him, hey, I thought you were going to save us $3 million on the snow clearing budget. He said, I did, but councillor, that's going to be service reductions. And so we thought we'd wait maybe 24, 36 hours after the snowfall before we get to the roads because we wanted to meet the $3 million service reduction that the council approved. And I went, okay, hold it, lesson learned. So I just impart that bit of history and knowledge and wisdom that wherever my colleagues by majority are potentially going, be careful where the service reductions or elimination of service levels is going to occur, because if that impacts within your own wards, I can just imagine, I've been around long enough to see once it's impacted within a ward, that particular library branch hours were reduced or a day closed during the week. Immediately, the ward councillor came forward, Madam Deputy Mayor, and of course we reinstated and restored the service level to what the community expected because that was important to community. So I just, from a departmental standpoint, Mike, whatever potential service realignments and or hypothetical reductions in levels of current service, we need the total upside and downside primarily of what that might mean, Mike. And to my colleagues, I just say that please be prepared. If it's something that you feel in order to meet a tax reduction overall, Madam Deputy Mayor, is important, then we have to lead by example and know the potential consequences. So I just throw that out as a caution. Mike, does this at all include potential targeting of sidewalk snow clearing that some of us, led by Councillor Nan, 6 months ago, asked staff to investigate? So through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, the potential of the city clearing targeted sidewalk areas this coming winter, is that part of the 5.5? Mike?
So through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, is the question whether or not it's captured as an enhancement
Yes.
within the 5.5?
Is it, please?
So through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, I'm going to assume it's not. Again, the 5.5 does not capture the council-referred items, which is principally the 10-year fire service delivery plan, as well as any other enhancements.
Okay, I didn't see that up there, Mike, along with fire and others that you did highlight, so I didn't see that, but it's something that a number of us would like to provide in our community. And again, I'm just trying to, as much as possible, see the comprehensive picture, even though today is day one. So I just want to make sure that's taken under advisement as well. And Mike, as you know, all the seniors programs we put in place, as many of our constituents that are seniors are hanging on to their homes. All the programs we have, tax rebate, tax deferral, subsidized housing, support for the LTCs, 6,000 seniors on the list for more LTC spaces. All of those currently are not being offered up at this time specifically in any way, shape, or form as a service reduction and or program reduction, Madam Deputy Mayor, through you.
So through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, I'm not sure I'm in a position to say that that comprehensive list, that there aren't some items on that comprehensive list that will form part of the strategy. Again, we are looking at, we're focused on discretionary funding, and some of what the councillor has highlighted does form part of discretionary funding. So again, I'm not suggesting that any or all, but again, is somewhat early stages, And I don't directly recall those, but again, I don't want to suggest that they don't form part of the strategy, especially under the 3.6. As I mentioned, under the 3.6 scenario, requires about $17 million in reductions, and we're looking at not only increasing user fees or introducing new user fees, we are looking at clawing back eligibility of some discretionary programs.
Thank you, Mike. I'm wrapping up, Madam Deputy Mayor. Obviously, I am extremely supportive. It's been too hard fought by past and this current term of the first year of this current term of council on so many of these senior programs that have truly helped, 4,000 seniors take advantage of our seniors tax rebate program. Any little bit to help them maintain their existence in their home without being institutionalized. So, Mike, obviously, I'm extremely supportive. And lastly, Madam Deputy Mayor, again, the Windsors and Flints of our world, they came in with much less tax increases. To my recollection over the years, we know that what their cities have gone, to my knowledge, what they've gone through. We know what Flint went through when they went with a cheaper water supply. Windsor's come in zero every year. Some of my colleagues in the past have pointed, oh, look, Windsor coming. And we know exactly they've cut programs, services. I'm not on for that, but it's going to be a tough balancing act between the 5.5 and what's reasonable in the next 6 months. Thank you, Mike. Thanks, Madam Deputy Mayor.
Thank you. And Councillor Marilla.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor. And firstly, let me say how much confidence I have in the fact that you're at the head of our financial department, Mike. And every budget period, I actually feel that way, so I need to say that publicly. Secondly, with respect to cynicism that exists, particularly towards politics and politicians, one thing that's interesting in the scale from 2008 to today is that most of the significant increases occurred, or most of the savings occurred in non-election years. So, in looking at that, I looked at every election year and I realized that politics was definitely not in play. That in essence, we did what was recommended and what was in the best interest of the city. And that's something that I think a lot of us take for granted and didn't even realize until I analyzed it. So I just want to make that point quite clear. Secondly, I think it's important to recognize that, as Councillor Jackson mentioned, the process over the years historically has been a shock and awe approach to budgeting. So there were times when, as you can recall, Mike, there were times when a list of cuts would be proposed. Everybody would be up in air, everybody's up in arms over it. The media has weeks and weeks and weeks of stories about how much we're going to impact quality of life in the city. I can recall issues such as closing down the Barton Street Library as a recommendation, or Parkdale Pool, or not burying people on social assistance. These are the kind of things that were presented as a viable option to save taxpayers' money, but had no real tangible means of getting or coming to fruition yet. A lot of fodder, a lot of drama. So I know that our number this year that's being proposed is high, and I just need to clarify, just for public reasons, that why do we start so high, and how do we, through a process of elimination, deduce it to bring it down to where it should be, where we always seem to land? Yeah. So can you just elaborate on what are the drivers and the pressures that lead to us doing this year in and year out?
Yeah. So through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, thank you for the question, because maybe I'll spend a little time just comparing 2020 again versus previous years and what we've done in the past to help us to achieve the outcome that we were able to achieve, the adjustments that we make through the budget process as part of that journey. But before I go there, I just want to make reference. I appreciate the complimentary remark, but there is a team of individuals that support me as it relates to me doing my job. So beyond senior leadership team and their input as it relates to your direction and trying to arrive at a target that has some meaning behind it, but as well sensitive to your committee's desire to adjust and reflect the affordability challenges in this community. Beyond senior leadership team is my team. So again, I think I just want to, normally I'll start these presentations by thanking my team for all their work and helping me to prepare for this. And I just want to say that because I know that members of my team were up till the late hours last night communicating with me in preparation of this presentation. So I just didn't want to go on without recognizing senior leadership team and my team for their great work. So to the question about where do we normally start, and how have we traditionally landed in that general range? There's been, I would say, a recognition that we needed to do a little more refinement to the forecasts in the latter part of this period versus the earlier part of this period. Some council members may recall we started in early years, post-amalgamation, we would have started much higher in terms of a starting point, and worked with committee and council to more affordable inflationary outcomes. In the latter parts of this time period, if you think back to the downloading and uploading history, is if we just focus on the last, let's say, 2016 to 19, just the Ontario Works uploading represented probably $3.2, $3.4 million annually in tax room. And then beyond the upload benefits is we didn't necessarily have these challenges. I don't recall when a particular budget item we saw a 40% increase in costs. So insurance premiums, a 40% increase in insurance premiums, and we're not alone. When we brought that report forward, there were 9 other municipalities that we identified, City of Toronto being one of those, that saw increase for various reasons. We have different claims, different exposures, but that industry seems to be passing on greater risk to the subscribers of their service. WSIB. That WSIB figure represents a number of factors. PTSD is something relatively new as it relates to a pressure for first responders. So that, in part, is part of that factor. Presumptive illness for firefighters has continued to become a pressure for municipalities and a factor into that WSIB number. So there's a number of changes as it relates to exposures for city employees that are contributing to the financial pressures that we're facing. The computer licensing being another example. The change in relationship, cost-sharing relationship. You know, over that 2008 to 2019, this is now somewhat new territory. Not new in that we didn't experience it prior to 2008, but we've gone an extended period of time where we had the opposite, where we had uploading instead of downloading. And what we're suggesting is, the messaging is, this isn't related just to 2020. We should expect this to a certain degree in 2021, specific around public health as they continue to move towards full transition to the 70-30 ratio, as well as child services.
On that point, sorry to interrupt, through you, Madam Deputy Mayor. On the point of the uploading, did the uploading actually meet the demand, however, with respect to what is actually has been downloaded? So is there still a gap between what's mandated for us to provide and what's being funded by the province, rather than a general levy?
So through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, if I understand the question, and I might turn to Paul, who has more familiarity, is there are still services that are cost shared. So whether it's OW admin, which I believe is 50-50 cost shared, I made reference earlier to housing. Housing, when it evolved, was probably somewhere in the area of $35 million in our operating levy. It now
So I guess
represents
my point is,
49.
When you said there was a period of time where there was uploading that mitigated it, but it's still a crisis.
So through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, it mitigated it. We still had exposure. We still had to make contributions towards those programs. And maybe I'll turn to Paul as it relates to whether or not beyond that funding level, there were still demands. And so I would say the wait lists are an indication where the financial resources still didn't align to the demands in the community.
Through the deputy mayor, the one piece on the uploading was restricted to the benefit payments to individuals. So there was no uploading of savings of costs on the cost of administration. And so that's what continues to be the pressure, and now has been compounded by keeping us to 2018 actuals. So what was uploaded was the payments to recipients of Ontario Work and some of the 100% programs around employment. It left the city continuing to provide a significant amount in that cost share program around administration, and that has not changed. We generally don't provide services beyond the provincial mandate, except in cases where council has directed us to deliver additional services with net levy dollars. For instance, council approved $2.5 million, I think, for additional homelessness programs. That's wrapped up in our consolidated homelessness programs. We do provide some programs through public health that are 100% net levy funded through council, but generally speaking, we keep within our area. We're not asked to do more and contribute more by the province. The contributions of net levy have come through council direction.
Okay. So it's still an impact, and one that was mitigated, but now we're faced with the reality of that being shut off. Is that correct through you, Madam Deputy?
Through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, yes. So the ratio is representing greater burden on local taxpayers, and going forward, we expect some of that to continue. And the uncertainty is, for instance, in the case of Ontario Works, I think what we're reflecting is the freeze on the level of funding to 2018. And so if that's frozen based on 2018 for the balance of this term of council, you have the compounding impact of inflationary pressures that will have to be borne by local residents.
Right. Hence the crisis that we're faced with. And tying in what you had mentioned earlier, through you, Madam Chair, the compounded annual infrastructure deficit that we're not meeting as well, which is how much again?
So through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, the figure that we have, the table using 2012 dollars was $195 million annually. Our gross is $3 to $3.3 billion. And I would simply say is other jurisdictions across this nation doesn't burn property taxes as it relates to social services, the delivery of social services. So by vacating that room would free up some funding capacity for municipalities to address some of the infrastructure deficits.
Just another means of getting to that issue, and the importance of keeping it at the forefront, because I think the province would love for us to forget about it. So I'll continue reminding everyone as long as I can. And I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Marula. Mr. Mayor.
Thank you, Councilor Marula, for a reminder, and it's a reminder that we need to keep sharing with the government, and I think we'll manage to do that. I would reiterate, over the last 10 years or so, we have been extremely well served by the finance team, coming in with, I think, transparent and realistic numbers even at the outset. And as much as it's painful to see, I think reality is staring us in the face, and I think we've managed to be able to do that for the last 10 years. I recall prior to that, budgets used to come in at 8 or 9% for a starting number, and there was always a finance director that had a back pocket solution to solving some of these issues, and that's not the case anymore. I think we're looking at stark reality here in terms of the challenges that we face. One of the challenges that we continue to have beyond income is not having kept pace with some of the escalating costs in Hamilton. I think that's always been a challenge. Is the kind of the slow or the loss of commercial industrial tax base over the last 20, 30 years. So there's been again a shift from commercial and industrial tax base to residential, and that certainly puts an awful lot of pressure on the residential taxpayer. Although, you know, as Councillor Jackson pointed out, we're meeting with some success, but we need many, many more successes to be able to offload that on the tax base side, but obviously the employment opportunities come with that. On that note then, Stelco, you know, some time ago got their properties reassessed at, you know, a dramatically low number, as I recall. My question to you, Mike, would be, is there now a move afoot to have those, you know, values reassessed again? Because obviously their value proposition has changed significantly, and I can't imagine, and I'm trying to remember the number, because I think we offered them the totality of what their assessment number was to purchase the entire balance of the property that was available, and the number was something like $50,000. Sam, I think you moved the motion at the time. Have we launched a you know, a reassessment process, or can we launch a reassessment process to recoup some of those lost tax dollars that have drifted away as a result of that reassessment?
So through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, I think I had a full head of hair before this particular file. So I'll just a quick summary in terms of what transpired as a result of the restructuring of U.S. Steel. Is the city saw significant erosion because of MPAC treating the property as a special purpose property and reducing, I believe, effectively our tax revenue from that action of MPAC was a reduction of about $3 million. So council gave staff direction to pursue all avenues as it relates to preserving that assessment base. We appealed the 2018 assessment and the 2019 assessment. We've garnered some expertise as it relates to evaluation of those lands. We've presented to MPAC, to all parties, Stelco and MPAC, all of the supporting documents that justify our position as it relates to the valuation of those lands, in the hope that not only would we preserve the valuation, but what we're suggesting is those lands may have a higher value than was originally, than the original assessment was based on. So again, to the mayor's question, we're in that process. We've appealed 2018 and 19. We've presented all of the documentation. I believe we did so in September, and we're in the midst of that process of awaiting feedback or response from the parties.
Great, thank you. And you know, I remember you know, the assessed value at that time. I can't even remember the number. It was ridiculous in terms of a per acre value. It was in the, you know, thousands, 10,000 or something per hectare. You know, it was a ridiculous number, as I recall it.
Yes. So through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, if I recall correctly, we were in excess of 100,000 per acre, down to $100 per acre, and that was based on MPAC treating that property as a special purpose property. And a surprise to us, again, is we've gone through the efforts to have an external expert go through a comprehensive valuation, and we feel that that value should be preserved, if not enhanced.
At least doubled. Make it $2 instead of, you know, or $200 instead of $100. But in any event, I'm glad you're on it, and I think that's an important issue for us, you know, tax-wise going forward. There's an awful lot of value there, and that certainly ought to be taxed accordingly. On slide 4, Mike, just to kind of put some context around what we've been able to do, you know, over the last 10 years. I mean, when we're working only at or below inflation, obviously we have each and every year additional costs, additional demand for services, additional labor costs. You know, just keep adding it up over and above the inflationary costs that we've been able to achieve. So I'm going to assume over that time period that we've been able to create efficiencies to withstand that to the tune of, you know, potentially $100 million. If I'm to assume, you know, potentially $12 or $15 million annually that we've had to absorb, we have actually reduced our costs to be able to absorb that over that 10-year period. Is that reasonably accurate?
So through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, I would say that's a fair comment. And I'll just simply say that just our employee-related costs would represent in each of those years about 1.5%. Over and above that, you have inflation to contracts. You have inflation around fuel prices. as well as in 2019, that's when we deviated from our previous practice of 0.5% for capital. So we've increased our contribution towards our capital program in an effort to leverage funding from senior levels of government. You'll recall around transit, we leveraged $36 million. So again, to Councillor Merla's previous question, how is 2020 different than those previous years? We're sitting at 1.12% for capital, when in previous years we were only at 0.5% for capital. So again, that 5.5% is different from previous years in that we are trying to leverage funding from senior levels of government around recreation, culture, our community facilities, as well as transit, and historically around water and wastewater as well.
But invariably, you know, our costs continue to increase, and so community continues to expand. Demand for services beyond what we have today, including fire, police, and other areas, are also, you know, pressures to expand to meet the service demands as well. Not necessarily captured in the 2% inflationary increases that we've been able to achieve over the last 10 years.
Yeah. Through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, that's correct. And just as it relates to growth in our community, is while this council and previous council has supported a principle that growth should pay for growth because of legislation and because of some discretionary programs to try to incent, there's a $15 million impact to taxpayers and ratepayers that are reflected in the tax and the rate program. So again, we're trying to put forward sustainable budgets where we provide these incentives, we're funding those at the back end of those incentives. So again, that's another factor as it relates to affecting our financial position.
Thanks, Mike. And I only say that to put this into context, because you know, people might assume that we just pass on a tax increase just because you know, it's the easy thing to do. In fact, we've been actually passing on, absorbing a lot of costs and keeping the tax rate down, and at the same time accommodating the kind of growth in services and benefits that have accrued to the community at large through that process. So at some point, it kind of catches up with you. I think we're kind of at that point, notwithstanding the kind of the added pressures of, you know, I would say the insurance premium, which is a climate change issue, which in fact probably is not likely to get better, but may in fact get worse as climate change impacts continue to accrue. And WSIB, and as a result of provincial policy, and I did hear the question from Councillor Wilson, and I'd be happy to sit down with you and kind of explain that we are struggling, you know, the same way that other departments here are struggling with presumptive PTSD, retirements, in that whole suite of things that the city is dealing with, the HSR is dealing with, the police is dealing with, and fire is dealing with. And so that creates budget pressures that are difficult to absorb, you know, going forward. So thank you for your I think, reasonably good start here, because I think based on all the pressures that we're seeing so far, this is going to be a tough budget year. I look forward to it like I look forward to my next root canal, but it's going to be a challenging year. And I think to Councillor Jackson's point, you know, it's easy for us to sit and say, let's reduce services until they actually hit the table, and we get to understand what those services are. And you know what the public demand would be in terms of how they enjoy those services and what that might set us back on if we don't deliver them. And you know, so I'm with Councillor Jackson that we better be sure, eyes wide open, that we're clear on what services we're prepared to impact or not impact before we start laying out dictates. And you know, what I don't want to have happen is to put our staff in a position of making that decision. And, you know, that's the tendency here is to, well, just go find 3%. Well, 3% has an impact, and it's a service impact and potentially a staffing impact. And I think that decision needs to happen here, not at the staffing level. And so I'm appreciative of our budgeting process. Fully understand that we're now seeing a bit of a tsunami in terms of additional costs, and many years of at or below inflationary increase is going to catch up to us at some point in time based on the growth that we're experiencing. And so that's just my rant for today. And, in terms of the police budget, happy to sit down with anyone that wants to understand the pressures that we're facing at the policing side as well, because they're just as significant as they are here. Thank you.
Thank you, and we're all waving to the St. Matthew's Catholic School that's sitting right outside here from Bimbrook, so that's why we're all waving. Thank you. Councillor Collins.
Thanks, Madam Chairman, and through you to Mike. Mike, I just want to echo my colleagues' praise of you, and as you mentioned, your team. You do an incredible job, and we're thankful to have you at the helm. Awkward question, and with some context, I was probably one of the biggest critics of the previous government as it relates to the direction they were taking, as it relates to very Toronto-centric, almost trying to out-left the left with many of their policies, and it created some certainly budget issues for a lot of people across Ontario. I have to give them kudos, though, I think, to your point, in terms of they were the first provincial government to address the historical downloading issues that we faced from leftover from the Harris days. And so for as much as I was critical of Kathleen Wynne Premier Wynne on a number of files, I certainly took every opportunity to thank them for, especially on the OW file, for their assistance to municipalities and obviously by extension to Hamilton in particular, because as you note with that 10-year graph that you provided to us as it relates to tax increases, some of that was in part because of the assistance we received at the time from the provincial government. It made it a little easier, put it that way. Times have changed, and that pendulum is now swinging the other way as it relates to the playbook is not upload but download. And last year was our first glimpse in terms of what was in store for municipalities with the new Ford government. And just to reiterate in terms of where we were, we were in a situation where we passed our budget, the provincial budget came out soon after, and through dribs and drabs through the media, we found out that in fact there were impacts to municipal budgets, and they would have a severe impact on our own. And of course, awkward situation for us because we had already passed our budget, hadn't made accommodation for some of those cuts or downloaded services, and we were scrambling to find ways and means in which to accommodate or make room for those additional expenditures. So I think there's an open question right now in terms of what path the Premier will take in light of the federal election. They've obviously walked back on many of those decisions that were made in their last budget. As you note, there's still 0.5% of that 5.5% is still attributed to the provincial government. What is in light of what happened last year, and knowing that there's two paths the Premier can take if he's trying to be, I think, a little bit more popular or populist as it relates to connecting with Ontarians and changing his plan, maybe that's not something we see this year, or if it's back to the playbook of the 90s and it's about still delivering the service but making municipalities pay for it, there's an impact. What is our plan B in that regard? And I know no one has a crystal ball to guess what happens, but if the scenario arises as it did last year, do we have something in the wings that's going to accommodate for downloaded services above and beyond what you've identified here today? And has SMT come up with a plan that says in the event that a month after we pass our budget, the province delivers us a couple of surprises, how are we preparing for that, I guess is the question.
So through you, Mr. Mayor, maybe I'll start, and I'm not sure if Paul will have some intel to share, so there are opportunities through this budget process which create some challenges, and then there are just some challenges through this budget process. So as it relates to opportunities, you'll have recalled that when you approved the grant applications under transit and the community, culture, and recreation, is the timelines for those programs don't align necessarily with our fiscal year and our budget process. So there's a disconnect. So we have an opportunity as it relates to furthering along year 5 of our transit strategy. The challenge is some of those preliminary timelines may be summer of 2020, which is outside of our budget process. So you may be asked to approve a budget with incomplete information as to those grant applications and the outcome of those. And so I don't have an answer in terms of how we will deal with those. I think we're going to have to get a better appreciation around the potential timing of those and help you as we navigate through the balance of this budget process. I'll just highlight 2017, the year that we identified some savings and efficiencies through complement reduction. We were in a similar situation, is we had requested funding from senior levels of government, and we were approving the budget without that information, and that caused us to pause on the transit strategy. So again, that is a real potential risk or scenario that we're going to have to work and navigate through. With respect to unknowns as it relates to the provincial government, there'll be a fall economic outlook. Typically, economic outlooks don't include policy changes. Those are typically delivered through the budgets. So I'm not sure that we would expect anything through this fall economic outlook, other than likely that the deficit is lower than forecast because of stronger revenues that the province is realizing. So we would typically wait to the budget process, which is typically a spring exercise for provincial and federal governments. So that could be anywhere from February to April. It varies. And again, that's a challenge to us because we could approve this budget and then realize some further provincial policy changes that affect us in 2020. So some risks, some unknowns, some opportunities that again represent some unknowns, and maybe I'll turn to Paul if he has any further intel with respect to where the province may be going around further policy changes in the balance of 2020.
Through the Deputy Mayor, probably three things. One is we have received better information about what the out years look like, so that allows us to plan a little bit better. In the case, for instance, of Children's Services, they've given us a notional sense of our allocations and the reductions that we can expect to see, pressures for 2021 and 2022. So that allows us to do some advanced planning. Secondly, we're not making similar assumptions that we did for 15 years. So that will help us in our mitigation strategies. We got caught just a little bit in terms of some of the paramedic work that we assumed things were going to happen the same way. They didn't. They seem to have gone back to the same way, but we'll do a better job of just not assuming that. And then the third piece is that we will look at how we would operate our services within the new frame of reference from a financial perspective, and that may mean asking for relief. For instance, in terms of some of our targets in Ontario Works, it may be that we request through public health that we not deliver to the same level of service under the standard. I can guarantee you we would not do that in any area that would set any risk to human health, but there are some other areas of policy work and things within public health that we could ask to be relieved from some of our targets in order to come more within budget. Those aren't things we like to do, but those are the kinds of things that would allow us not to be in the trap of having to find $1 million, $1.5 million in year in order to make the services work.
Okay, thanks for that. For me, I think we all know something's coming. We just don't know what and to what extent. And so if there's a way for us to somehow try to prepare for that, and I think we kind of need some discussion around when those services are cut or they're loaded to the city, and I think the term you used, Mike, and I wrote it down, align service levels to provincial funding. Does that mean that by default the city is going to then pick up these services and or costs that have been cut by the province? Or I think Councillor Marula had a speech one day at committee where it's, these need to be passed along to the public to show exactly what the provincial government is doing to services, and it's just unsustainable for us in terms of trying to pick up all these costs. So I don't know in terms of which ones you have in front of us now, which ones are, some of them are mandatory. They download services. Housing's a great example. Here are the keys to several hundred or thousand affordable housing units. No money is attached to them. You're required to operate them. You pay for them, capital and operating. Others there's a little bit more discretion. So I don't know what services or cuts have been made where there is some discretion as it relates to aligning our own budgets to provincial services. So could you help us with that in terms of others will come? What's our what's our policy here municipally? Are we picking up the tab for everything that's downloaded and delivering those same services? Or will those cuts flow through to whatever service areas have been impacted by the province?
So through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, maybe I'll start with the first one and maybe Paul can expand on it because I did have a chance to review the funding allocation agreement that I think we just received 2 days ago. And so with respect to the childcare, the 2020 allocation, I think, is 70 million in total. 10 million of that relates to this $2.6 million. So again, in 2019, the allocation was in excess of $12 million. In 2020, it's capped at $10 million. And so the ratio, the recommended ratio is proposed to change from 100% provincially funded to 80-20, but I think there is some discretion, and maybe I'll turn to Paul with respect to the $2.6 million and the impact it would have on subsidized spaces as relates to childcare.
Through the Deputy Mayor, I think the simple answer to the question is we're not assuming that all of the services would automatically be picked up by net levy. We'll be having those conversations through the budget process. Mike's comment is a good one. So the reality is to keep service at the same levels in childcare, not expansion, but the same level, we would be needing to contribute close to $2.6 million within that. It equates to about 370 subsidized childcare spaces. And so the conversation is, are those spaces removed from the system in terms of being subsidized, and we would do that in a planned way as children come in and out of those spaces, or do we contribute the net levy dollars to remain whole? We've not made the assumptions on that. We will be bringing forward what we think is some reasonable recommendations around that as part of the budget process, and that would continue across our other services as well. A little more challenging in Ontario Works because where the squeeze is on the administration of the service, to which we don't have a choice but to. So we would then have to look at ways that we could reduce the amount that the municipality is having to make up for a budget freeze to 2018 levels by doing some things that may have some impact on service delivery in terms of time and quickness of responses and perhaps the number of locations that we offer service in. But the reality is we don't have a choice but to deliver Ontario Works, so that one's a little bit tricky. So that gives you a couple of ideas of how we'll bring it. We have not made the automatic assumption, however, that all of those costs would be picked up by the property taxpayer.
Thanks for that, Paul. And I think that's an important statement that was made in terms of there will be some discretion with some of these. And so as long as we have as much information at this table as possible to make informed decisions, I think that's very important. And it sounds like, as per Paul's statement, that's the plan. As it relates to budgeting to actuals, we've been the beneficiary of some very positive year-end statements and variance reports over the last number of years. I think 1 year there was an anomaly, and that's apart from rates. I look at housing as an example. We had a very good discussion at Community Services not too long ago as it relates to the reconciliation process. And of course, through the reconciliation process, for a number of years, there have been very large variances. And I use as an example, we have a number of city housing developments underway, 500 McNabb, Jamesville, there are a couple of them there where we're still taxing residents for housing resources where we have empty properties. And so that's a very basic way of looking at it. There are many more factors that go into the reconciliation process than that. But I use that as an example to say that if there's a way for us to reduce those surpluses and those variances and to come in better to actuals, I think there's an opportunity there. And I know just from speaking to our own finance staff at CHH, we had just, I think, informed Housing Services that we're foregoing $1.6 million that we had last year as a result of some of those issues that I just referenced. So I think there's some low-hanging fruit there in that area. We did give direction at Community Services in terms of to look at the reconciliation process and whether there's any opportunities to bring that down through the budget process so we don't end up with these very large year-end surpluses. No reason to tax the community for resources we're not using. So I think that's an important issue to look at, Mike, and I know that it's already on the radar screen, but I want to emphasize there are opportunities there. Same with police. So I raised this earlier this morning with Brian in terms of, we know that we've had tremendous challenges in terms of, new recruits, It's a theme that is with policing, not just in Ontario, but across Canada in terms of attracting people to the occupation. And when we do attract people and we attempt to put them through the training process, we're limited and constricted and constrained by the number of positions we get at the Ontario Police College. And so there's a lag and there's a gap between the time that we hire or make a decision to hire either new recruits with new resources that have been provided, such as was the case last year. Mike, you mentioned there was 24 new positions. And also, there's also a lag between people retire, and to be clear, this is, I think, at one of our previous meetings, we just learned, this is a record year for retirements for Hamilton Police Service. And so we have a very large pool of vacancies that have been created by that issue as well. So I'm hoping that finance staff can meet with finance staff at police to determine, again, a phased approach in terms of there's no sense charging for the resources for these vacancies only to know that they won't be filled for another year or 18 months. So somehow we need to do, similar to housing, budgeting to actuals rather than the positions that are there. Presto, I really don't, I'm almost at a loss in terms of what question to ask for Presto, because this just seems to be a never-ending story here. Is there light at the end of the tunnel on the Presto issue, or is this just one of those downloaded costs that we're forced to pay because it's contractual? If we don't pay, we're subject to lose transit dollars from the province, which is the political blackmail that I referenced before. Is this a trend that, Mike, that's going to continue for another 3, 5, 10 years, where we get these huge cost increases and very little service improvements to show for it? Through you, Madam Chairman.
So through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, based on staff's report, Public Works report in 2018, the shorter answer is yes, we should expect this to continue. That report, we identified, I think in 17, our costs related to the Presto agreement was $422,000, set to grow to just in excess of $4 million by 2027. And but that is, I'll describe it as front-ended, in that we should expect that escalation as you're seeing it here in those early years of that agreement. So in part, it's driven by the adoption of Presto. What's a bit of a complicating factor for municipalities like Hamilton is we offer many payment options to our users because of challenges in part that some of our users have in the city of Hamilton. I'll just remind committee, and in terms of this pressure, in 2018, we would have presented this with an offset. So the previous government had committed to doubling the provincial gas tax funding. So that would have represented about $11 million in annual additional funding to municipalities who are transit providers, dedicated for transit. So again, previously, we would have offsetted that potential $4 million pressure against the $11 million that we would have expected to see in additional funding. So again, it's a obligation under our agreement with Metrolinx. We should expect this to continue to be a pressure in the coming years. Again, last year we were projecting that this will ultimately grow to a $4 million impact by 2027, but recognizing that based on adoption, it's going to be the earlier years rather than the tail end of that period.
Okay. Last question is, and thank you for that. Last question through you, Madam Chairman, is the theme of divesting ourselves of some of our assets. And so I know some of my colleagues, as a for instance, are looking at some of the smaller buildings in the suburban areas in terms of working with service clubs and other agencies to take on. I think that's a tremendous partnership opportunity in terms of us getting out of paying for some of those capital and/or operating costs. So I would support them when they bring those motions forward. You know, I use my own example in terms of Stony Creek Arena. It's been on life support for a number of years now. There are currently, to best of my knowledge, I don't think there are any more Stony Creek teams that are playing. The association has gravitated from that arena now to other facilities in the city, some of them private. And so now we're getting overflow hockey associations from other geographic areas. And so I'm anxious to understand how best to plan for the closure of some of these facilities. There's nothing in the 10 or 20-year capital budget that suggests there's resources on the horizon to fix an arena that is, you know, in some cases, the equipment or the infrastructure is 30, 40, 50 years old. So I think these are some of the discussions we need to have, and I know that these are small operating costs, you know, whether it's $300,000-$400,000 here and there. All of them certainly add up to assisting us in trying to get to a lower tax increase. So I just put that on the table I'm open for that discussion in terms of where it makes sense. As Councillor Jackson mentioned earlier, it's easy to come forward with recommendations where it's a slash and burn mentality, and that hasn't helped us in the past in terms of helping us get to our goals, at least in terms of with community buy-in. And so I'm open to that, and I look forward to those discussions as well. And I think at this point, that's the extent of my questions.
Thank you, and just a reminder to turn your phones off. Councillor Nan, then Councillor Pauls, and I have myself down about 5 speakers ago. Councillor Nan.
Thank you, through the Deputy Mayor. Thank you, Mike, for the presentation. I had a question regarding revenue generation. So when Councillor Farr had asked the question, you had responded that we'd likely see more details around what the revenue generation could look like inside the departmental budget presentations that are to come in the budget process. I had a kind of general question about how our municipality has previously approached or explored bonds. Especially when it comes to climate mitigation, being able to fund capital projects that specifically benefit the environment to achieve positive climate impact. I know that the city of Ottawa, for example, recently in 2017 released a green bond program that they were able to leverage to finance their light rail transit and multimodal transit. It goes on to identify energy projects, infrastructure, reduction in pollution, ecosystem protection, and funding of green buildings. So I was just curious where that discussion has been historically for our city.
So through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, great question for a finance person. So we have been monitoring green bonds. We are interested in participating in the green bond market for, I would say, 2 to 3 reasons. One is there is an increasing market for investment in environmentally sensitive projects or in projects that are going to have a lesser impact to the environment, the built environment, principally the built environment. So I think there may be a bit of a misconception that municipalities have a endless demand for bonds, and that if we just go out to market, someone there's interest in the market as it relates to subscribing to municipal bonds. That's not the case. And so we have to align ourselves to the marketplace as it relates to going out with bond issuances. The other is, I think in the case of, so Ottawa was our early adopter as it relates to green bonds. Their experience has been that they were able to, and the term we use is shave, they were able to achieve a cost to borrow which was probably a few basis points lower than had they gone out with a traditional bond. And as people think, well, a few basis points, what's the significance if it's 3.17 versus 3.25? Well, if you're going out with a 15-year or a 30-year bond, those basis points start to add up to hundreds of thousands of dollars in savings over that time period. So a opportunity as it relates to placing, finding the market. The second opportunity is potentially borrowing at a lower cost. And the third opportunity, frankly, is image. There's a benefit to the corporation, to the city of Hamilton, if we're able to not subscribe to, but to leverage that green market, and recognizing that corporations report on buying opportunities and investments in municipalities. So there's a marketing image opportunity for the city of Hamilton too.
Excellent. So in terms of, you mentioned that you're keeping a close eye to it and identified the 3 potential benefits of pursuing something like this. for our municipality. Is this something that would be in the purview of the task force that is the interdepartmental task force looking at how our city will achieve climate positive impact? And how do you see it fitting in within the budget process moving forward?
So through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, as I recall, I know Brian has spoken previously to the Climate Change Task Force with respect to this opportunity, so we are monitoring it. I should point out that in order to leverage this opportunity, is the municipality needs to have green initiatives. So whether those are transit initiatives, wastewater treatment plant, water, so we have to find a significant size, some materiality, so it would have to be, I'm going to make some assumptions that the market's going to want 30 million plus. So as part of our investment strategy, I would say it to Councillor Nan's question around how does it fit in, it fits in part through our capital budget process. So as we look at the reliance on debt, the green bonds would be part of that strategy.
Great, thank you so much, Mike.
Thank you. Oh, Councillor Pauls?
Thank you. Through the chair. First of all, thank you for helping us understand this in-depth budget. But I wanted to ask you, the in-year request from council, what is the breakdown of some of these requests, especially by wards? I don't, can you name a couple of them or even by ward or?
So,
Enhancements?
no, so through you, Madam Deputy Mayor,
Page 18, you have the inquest request from council.
through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, this really speaks to requests for information. So as standing committees or council request new information or additional information, looking at alternative service delivery models, changes in financing strategies, that takes time and effort, and not necessarily, and when they're in year, recognizing that we've developed business plans and work plans at the start of the year, it crowds out other work, or it causes additional demands on staff. So in some cases, it may be overtime, and other times it's staff just absorbing the work. And so it has an impact on staff, it has a potential impact on financials. So it's not necessarily financial in your requests or capital. This is about workload. This is about requests for information, and part of the mitigation strategy may limit those resources. It may result in eliminating some of those resources that we've relied on to compile that information. So it could cause delays in providing that information, or in some cases where there's time sensitivity, we may have to subscribe to external resources or support to do that work.
I understand. So by ward, everybody would have different requests, of course, so.
So through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, it'll vary.
Yes.
I'm assuming that there's, in your requests across, around the horseshoe, depending on what issues arise in the wards. But again, I would assume it reflects across the corporation. But again, I don't have a sense as to that distribution, whether or not it's a greater demand in from any particular ward.
Also, another question, on 18, you say reduce or eliminate services. Is that referring to 19 as well, closed facilities, the old ones? And will we have a review of all of them that are in-depth study of each one of them? The facilities are needed either upkeep or they're not used as much. Will we have that listing?
So through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, I would expect as we've evolved our performance measurement and tracking our service levels relative to targets, I expect those conversations will rely on that evidence and that information. So if staff are recommending a reduction to service levels, it's because of information we have as it relates to our service levels relative to our comparator municipalities or the utilization of a particular facility. So to the councillor's question, it wouldn't necessarily be a business case or in-depth. It would be relying on some performance measurements and some evidence.
So we will have a list of facilities, for page 19, it says closed facility related to the service. Will we have a list of them that are considered not being used, they need too much work, and they need to be closed?
So through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, that's my expectation as we proceed through this budget process. It's typically in the new year that after the departmental presentations, we would identify mitigating actions. And I think Councillor Collins raised an important point, is that while an action may not result in a very material, immediate savings, is by divesting in a facility over time, there's savings because now you're not having to upkeep that facility. You're not replacing roofs 10 years from now. You're not having to do structural repairs 10 years. So it eliminates the liability on a go-forward basis.
And the last question, because I'm new, it says reduce grants to external agency. Do we also have a breakdown of every agencies we give money? We have it now, right? And will that be considered to look at them again and see where we could, because, we want to obtain to achieve 4.6%. So will we look at it again, or we just assume, that's what we're doing?
Yeah. So through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, I don't want to leave committee or the community with the impression that we have a identified course of action as it relates to these. But as with senior levels of government, one of the areas that you look at is discretionary spending, and grants are discretionary spending, and we're just identifying that that is an area to pursue.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I had myself on the list, but we're going with Councillor Clark first, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Mayor. You can go first if you wish. It doesn't
No,
matter.
I'm not that chair.
I never said you were. Thank you very much. First, I do want to thank Mike and his staff, because I found over my years of dealing with you, your responses to inquiries from councillors, whether it's from us as a whole or individuals, has always been comprehensive, fact-based. You don't gild the lily. You just tell us exactly what's going on, which is really important when we're trying to deal with these things. So I sincerely appreciate that. The first question is with regards to the transit procurement report. I filed a motion that was approved, and I am concerned about purchasing new transit in this year and not being still under that transit model where the cost seems to have gone up. So do we have any idea, will that report come back in time so that it may or may not, or so that we can consider it within the budget year? This is the Metrolinx. We're all in, we gotta buy buses through Metrolinx because we save money that way, and yet that didn't really pan out that way.
Dan?
Through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, I don't have the firm date in front of me right now, but I can certainly find that for you and get back to you.
It would be helpful, because I know HSR is looking at more buses, and so we want to make sure that our policies are in place and our decisions are based on the facts. And so if we're not saving money and there's another way of doing it for us, then let's make sure we do that as a part of the 2020 budget process. Second question is with regards to all of the, I guess, economists' trepidations about a potential recession. We're in our 11th year, everything's going great, the economy is booming, it can't go on forever, is the basic response. So my concern is if there are indicators, and I know the bond yield changed a bit, and so that bond yield was an issue that usually is the first flag that, okay, something's not right here, people are getting a little bit skirmish, so we have to pay attention. How are we looking at contingencies? I know our social services reserves aren't exactly where they should be, where we need them in this type of situation. So can you just provide some comments in terms of how you're looking down the road? What contingencies are we going to have to bring in? Will we have the appropriate level of reserves if a recession hits, and the impacts?
So through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, let me pull out my third-year business cycle textbook. We can talk about it. Inverted yield bonds. So what the councillor's referring to is economists look for triggers for recession. An inverted yield bond, which means I can borrow money for 30 years at a lower rate than I can borrow money for 2 years, which seems abnormal to many of us who recall the 80s when people had mortgages that were double digits in the 20s. And so it's a trigger, and it's not a perfect science. So the councillor's right. Is typically through business cycles, one would expect a recession. There's growth periods, and then there's downturns, and there was this perfect science or this perceived social science of every 4 or 5 years. I would say there seems to be consensus, so I'll rely on economists. There seems to be consensus in part because of the fact that we as individuals are so leveraged that there is in terms of debt burden per individual, that there is limited capacity for the central banks. And in fact, I think in Europe, and I apologize, I'm going to bore everyone, but in Europe, they have, in fact, adjusting for inflation, they have a negative interest rate for the central bank. So there seems to be some consensus that in the immediate term, they're not forecasting a recession. But to the councillor's more direct question on how do we insulate ourselves and prepare ourselves for recessions is the work that we've done over the last number of years towards rebuilding our reserves. So one strategy to see any corporation through a recession is to have cash in the bank to see you through a downturn. So whether it's having reserves and planning to see staff through and do the work as relates to planning applications, whether it's, in fact, our unallocated capital reserve. So this is our one reserve where our balance is above council's set target. The positive opportunity with that is when the senior levels of government put forward a grant program, because that typically is what happens, is during a recession, they try to trigger some employment and economic activity. So if you don't have cash in the bank, you can't participate in the game. And so part of our strategy is to build up those reserves such that if there is future acceleration of infrastructure, we can participate in the game, that we can have the financial flexibility to make that contribution, recognizing that often require some local contribution incrementality. So in terms of the financials, we try to deal with that. I mean, one of the benefits of the uploading is our exposure as municipalities is different than pre-uploading. As Paul's identified, we still have exposure cost sharing around Ontario Works Admin, but the actual programs have been uploaded. So if there is a downturn, assuming the provincial government doesn't change that ratio, that funding mix, we're somewhat insulated because now the province of Ontario, rightly so, has more exposure, rightly so because they have the tools to deal with recessions, and that is income tax, consumptive taxes, and corporate taxes. So sorry if I bored the horseshoe, but the short answer is we have embarked on trying to protect ourselves around recessions. We've tried to build some financial capacity, and there seems to be some consensus that it's not imminent, but there will be a reset. There's always been cycles, and we should expect at some point some market adjustments. The question is what will drive it?
It's not if, it's when. And I appreciate the answer because if municipalities have not done that work in advance and they're not prepared, then it is doubly hard on them when that downturn hits. So I appreciate the staff work on it. The last question I have is really the initiation of the review of these possible mitigating actions. And there's a number of them there. So is staff just automatically going to come forward with different mitigating options? Or are we, as councillors, expected to provide direction? We'd like you to look here, but not there. Just trying to understand the game plan. I know Councillor Danko, for example, had proposed and I may be using the wrong terminology, but basically garbage collection every 2 weeks as opposed to weekly, which is a mitigating action. It lowers costs. So will staff be coming forward with reports on that type of thing, or do we have to direct you to do that? So just, I don't want to be here 2 months from now saying, yeah, we should have looked at that, too late now.
So through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, the engagement is part of the objective today. I know we've provided a very high-level description on how we're proposing to report back with respect to mitigation. But if there are examples, and I'm familiar with Councillor Danko's proposal with respect to the waste, and so that is something that may be a 2021, 22. Nonetheless, it's as we embark on multi-year budgets, we should be looking at options beyond 2020, looking at 21 and 22. So I would say the purpose for today is to engage. If there are areas that you're suggesting that we put on our radar to investigate and potentially come back, that's what we're hoping to hear back from committee today.
And likewise, there's the opportunity for council direction, like I think it was Councillor Farr, and he just walked in, so it popped into my head, and Councillor Collins on the West Harbour issue, not canceling projects within the West Harbour initiative, but phasing it so that it's over a longer period of time, which enables us to maintain that project while minimizing the impact on the budget. So that is another option that's available to us.
So through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, I think you're going to see some of that in the budget presentations capital in about a month's time. But again, that's always a opportunity as to cash flow projects, defer projects. So we're not eliminating the investment, we're just spreading it over what may be a more affordable timeline.
And finally, the issue of the green bonds. I still have nightmares about asset-backed commercial paper. So I just want to be clear, they're not the same animal. One was a financing model, I guess, an investment strategy, and we got caught up in that. And the other one is basically a different financing model of actually borrowing money.
Yeah, through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, I'm not sure I wouldn't necessarily describe it different. I think it's a bit of the market. There's a market for issuing bonds for environmentally sensitive projects. So the financial institutions have identified a market. It's really a bond issuance, but it's tied to green initiatives. So it has to be transit, water or wastewater. It has to be projects with a positive impact to the environment. So it really is a bond issuance. It's just that the bundle of projects have to be tied to positive outcomes to the environment. So to the councillors, it's a very appropriate question. We're not looking at a high-risk instrument here. We're really looking at the instrument because it might be a lower cost, has a positive image impact to the municipality. And finally is there could be some challenges for municipalities to place bonds out there, especially serial bonds. And we've typically issued some serial bonds. And so we need to exhaust all of our opportunities so that when we do require some leveraging as it relates to making investments, that we find the market to place our bonds in.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation.
Thank you. Actually, I was going to leave your microphone on if you don't mind, just to keep the chair so I can ask my questions.
Would you like to speak?
Yeah, that'd be great.
I recognize the good counselor.
Thank you. I'm going to turn your microphone off now. Slide 4, please. Thank you very much, Mike, for your in-depth, not only your presentation, but your comprehensive answers are mind-boggling at times. It's awesome. So this chart is more or less, in my humble opinion, a little bit on the misleading side because every year our taxes increased. When you look at this, it looks like it decreased, but it didn't. It was on a gradual increase all the way up. If I add up all the percents in the last 12 years from 2008 to 2019, we're just under 23%. You referred to a home earlier, and I like that analogy because it helps me to explain this to our residents. So like a home, we have mortgages, which is, in our world, it's cost of borrowing. We have food. In our world, it's our employment costs, and on and on. So do we have a chart with that 23%, under 23% increase? How much all those things increased over the years? And have we been on top of it? Have we been under it? Are chasing it?
So through the chair, I think the councilor's asking, how do we compare, how does that compare with Consumer Price Index, which is a bundle of goods? That's
What we pay.
That's your clothing, that's your food, that's your utilities. So over that 12-year period, Consumer Price Index was 1.8%. So we were on average 1.9%. The inflationary Consumer Price Index, that's what households hear over the radio, on print media, they hear inflation, Consumer Price Index is increasing by 1.8%. So over that same period, we came pace with the Consumer Price Index. I just want to say that as a municipality, we differ from households because we don't subscribe to the same goods. So we don't necessarily buy food at the same proportion, clothing. So our consumer, municipalities' Consumer Price Index, and some municipalities have undertaken this, is our bundle of goods has increased at a higher rate because it's fuel, it's our collective agreement obligations. So what taxpayers need to understand or appreciate is we use CPI because an average resident knows what CPI is. But inflation for us is very different because we don't subscribe to clothing, we don't subscribe to food, and those are some of the goods that have stayed relatively low or stable. But if you think back to peak oil, we were going through some extraordinary fluctuations as it relates to fuel and utilities.
And thank you for that. And I think that's where I was coming from, actually, was when we show the residents that our vehicle insurance increased too, our fuel costs, our maintenance costs, and state of repair, we have to put money aside every year for the roofs. And as I said, it's food, but we can almost say that's employment costs. So it would be really interesting to see apples to apples in that respect, to show people, yes, you've paid more insurance for your car. You've paid more insurance for your house over the last 10 years. This is what we have as well. And that's why it's all comparative. Anybody on the grants committee, and I'm going to switch over to slide 2, sorry. Because one of the things you've got here is boards and agencies target a guideline of 0%. I believe that's also all the committees that we have under our purview as well. So anybody that's on the grants committee will tell you that the costs of doing events and the costs of doing anything now has increased tenfold, especially the Santa Claus parades and the Veterans Remembrance Day, because the policing has increased significantly. Road closures have increased significantly. Santa Claus, yeah, I'm just bringing it down to bare facts here. So that's the part that's very frustrating for some of these committees because we keep telling them it's a 0. So for instance, the Veterans Committee, I'm going to be very parochial. $25,000 every year goes to the Veterans Committee and they handle all the events across the city. In the last couple of years, they've had to spend over $40,000 because the cost of policing, road closures, we're now doing live streaming because we have inclusive policies now, and we have all extra costs on top of that, and yet we're telling them to stay at a 0 balance, as we do all the other committees. So it's really frustrating when they're using up all the reserves. Now there's no savings account to go to, and we're saying 0 balance, hold the line, and yet all their other costs are increasing, and they're beyond our control. So it was more of a comment than anything. So if I can direct you to, and thank you, Councillor Collins, for the Presto question. That was asked and answered, and the West Harbor question was asked and answered. And as far as slide 18 and 19, I think this is the one that's going to give us the most angst, because we do have community facilities that we've worked very hard with those service clubs to maintain and keep them open. So I really appreciate Councillor Jackson's comment and the mayor's comment to include the word counselor in, because there could be a simple solution to some of this. So I'm really appreciative if we can just at least get the heads up and have a discussion before it's brought here for any deferral or any conversation. So slide 20, you talked about Bill 108, community benefit charges. This quick question here is, I thought that the developers paid this. Am I incorrect in my assumption? So why it would be here if it's challenging to us, if it's the developers that pay?
Through the chair, I would describe it as an unknown right now.
Okay.
So while the province has taken the principle that it will be revenue neutral to municipalities, it begs the question, why transitioning from development charges for soft services to a community benefit charge? There's some concerns that this charge will be based on land valuations, and the concern is that we could have soft services and parkland dedication competing for some revenue base. That's our concern. And so, we may be before committee at a future date to set some priorities once we have a better understanding of what that regime involves.
Okay, thank you very much. And I'll take the chair back. Thank you, Councillor Clark, and I'll take you off. And last speaker is the mayor again. Thank you. You're the last. Make it snappy. Oh, I'm sorry.
Lamenting the high cost of Santa Claus, actually, that's a worry. Mike, the one thing that I think we should have a look at, and I'm not necessarily recommending this, but as I recall, Toronto got a special act to actually level charges against land transfer tax and vehicle registration. Now, I recall that they've only maintained the land transfer tax, and it's it's a significant revenue stream for them. In fact, as I recall it, when we asked the question to the previous government whether we had those abilities to charge, the answer I recall getting was, if you ask us, we'll allow it, but it's not as of right. So do we have any information on that? I'm not suggesting we go down that road, but I think it'd be important for us to know whether those tools are available to us.
So through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, we haven't engaged staff at the provincial level to discuss whether or not that is a opportunity. I'll just remind this council, the previous council, we brought forward a report with through the province's consultation process, and that was on the recommended lists, and committee struck that from the list. So we did submit a amended list of revenue tools. So again, that is something we can take back if the request is that we take back the question to provincial staff whether or not there continues to be an opportunity to engage the province around revenue tools. We can take that away.
Yeah, I think it's important to do. We may or may not decide to take it on, but I think knowing what our options are from the provincial level as well as our own in terms of internal revenue opportunities, I think would be helpful for us to understand. So I don't know if you need direction on that, but I think it'd be helpful for us to know whether or not this province would say, yes, you have the green light to go there, or no.
So would you like to do that in a motion, sir?
I can do that.
Yep, to
Sure.
direct staff. Okay, thank you. So I know you spoke to it, but moved by Councillor Wilson. How's that? No, you were busy chitty-chatting.
Be paying attention.
Yeah, jibber-jabbering. Councillor Wilson and the mayor, that the staff be directed to go to, it's just a motion to put on the floor. Are you okay with that, Mr. Mayor, or do you want to wait until you're done?
I can put the motion wherever you like. So if you want me to put the motion, I can say that the motion is that we direct our staff to ask the province if the revenue tools that Toronto was given are available to other municipalities, including Hamilton.
Okay, and it's seconded by Councillor Wilson. It's on the floor, Mr. Mayor?
Yep.
So I'm going to refer now to the speakers list, if I may. Councillor Marula, is this about the motion?
It is.
Go ahead.
So through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, I think we all know that we can create a Hamilton Act through legislation at Queen's Park. I believe I brought forward a motion in my first term between 2001 and 3 in order to do just that for this very reason. But all you're basically doing is asking the province for powers to tax. So we know we can do that. So through you, Madam Chair, Through the Toronto Act, they just needed legislation. We as a municipality can request the same. So what's the process accordingly?
So through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, I'll just remind committee, the previous term there was a consultation process whereby the province was asked municipalities which revenue tools municipalities were interested in the hope that there would be some consensus. I would describe it as there was a lack of consensus, and it seemed to die at the provincial level in terms of moving that along beyond what is provided to the City of Toronto. So again, if this motion is approved, we would just simply ask the province whether or not that there may be a future consultation process whereby municipalities are once again engaged as to whether or not there's a interest in leveraging some of the same tools that the City of Toronto has, or potentially other tools. So it's more about just, again, asking the question whether or not the province will entertain a similar engagement process.
Well, through you, Madam Deputy Mayor, just as a warning, when I did bring it forward, I was actually targeted quite a bit, because the solution is for a municipality to look at ways of taxing more as opposed to finding savings. So the thrust of the criticism, and it was quite significant at the time, was why don't you find ways of saving money as opposed to taxing more? But, so I just don't want that same narrative to start being created again based on this discussion, because we're not sure if we even want to go down that road. But I just don't, what's really a pet peeve of mine is the news cycle that's 20 years and then things are repeating itself. I just don't want to read the same story that I read 20 years ago again. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Collins.
Thanks, Madam Chairman, and I'm not interested in going down that road. We've entertained this a couple of times. I don't know if anyone's read the paper lately, but we have an affordability issue in the city. So if we're going down the road in terms of land transfer tax and trying to make the sale and purchase of properties more expensive in this community, I'm not on for it. Again, as Councillor Marula just mentioned, it's an easy out to look for these new taxes in order to disguise some of the cost pressures that we're forced to grapple with. We did that, tried that with the rain tax in terms of, we're going to have our water wastewater bill, we're going to have our regular tax bill, and then we're going to have a rain tax. We did that before in terms of the land transfer tax. Toronto's looked at others. New taxes aren't the answer in terms of solving our problems. And so I have to agree with Councillor Marula on that side of the equation. So if this is about going down that road, and I don't know what the motivation is, I always regret sometimes looking back saying, geez, if I just put up my hand and shared my concerns instead of just going along with things to be nice, I'm not interested in this one. So I won't be supporting what's being asked of us today.
Thank you. And I have Councillor Pearson, please.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Mayor, and I have to concur with the previous speakers, because I was going to ask that we get the information back, because we've gone down this road, and I think the suggestion was that, we're only cutting our nose off to spite our face, and I don't think we want to be in that position, and, we keep driving staff to keep bringing us more information, and time is money, and it's costing them time as well. That's taking them away from the more important things that we need to deal with, so I won't support it. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Wilson.
Thank you. I will support staff, the request for staff to look at and provide an analysis, because while I appreciate the comments about affordability, we also know that with an analysis we can clearly reveal some of the inequities that are behind some of the fees in which we charge and we don't charge. And I think this would be revealing of ability to pay. And we know for sure, if we're concerned about ability to pay, that there are some practices that we do that do place an unfair burden, but it's just not really revealed in our practice and our policy. So I think it is incumbent on us to do our due diligence, see the feasibility, what this could potentially mean in terms of revenue, addressing concerns about our deficit with that revenue, and the impact of who, in fact, in terms of principles of equity and ability to pay, who would be likely impacted by that. And I would like to do that on behalf of my residents, and I suspect they would expect nothing less of me. Thank you.
Thank you. So the motion's on the floor. Electronic vote, please. Thank you. And it's defeated, correct? Sorry, I should have referred to you. Okay, so that wraps up our speakers list, folks. I need a motion, please, to receive Mike's presentation. Councillor Pauls, Councillor Collins, all those in favor? Thank you, and I also need a motion to receive the staff report on 6.1. Councillor Nan, Councillor Vanderbeek, all those in favor? And I need a motion to adjourn. Everyone, all those in favor? Thank you.